you would take your seats, we're about to start. Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome all of you to this new edition of the OECD Global Forum on Competition. I'm very happy to see you in the room after 2 years where I saw you mostly on Zoom, and it's very nice to be able to have a direct interaction as we will have. I want to welcome the 101 delegations as of yesterday who have registered for this event. And I also want to extend my welcome to those of you who are connected to our proceedings because they couldn't make it to Paris. We have a rich agenda during those 2 days. We will have an inaugural session, and I want to particularly extend my thanks to Mr. Secretary General of OECD, Matthias Cormann, to Vice President Vestager, and to Ms. Grynspan, who will be from UNCTAD, who will be addressing us through a video to start our proceedings. After this inaugural session, we will go into 4 topics which are, I think, highly important and much discussed. The first one will be on the goals of competition and competition policy. As you know, in many countries, there are questions about what is the scope, what is the purpose of competition policy, how should it evolve, if it should evolve. And we will have a really rich exchange, I think, on this. After this, we will move on to a question of the interaction between competition trade when it comes to subsidies. As you know, subsidies are very much in the actuality, particularly between Europe and the US right now. But in general, we know that in trade relations, subsidies can distort international competition. What are those subsidies? How are they taken into consideration in competition law enforcement will be our second topic. Tomorrow, we will have 2 sessions. One session will be on merger remedies, and the other one will be on the relationship between competition authority and sectoral regulators, which is also a question, which is a delicate question. It's very clear for those of you who participated in the competition committee the first 2 days or 3 days, sorry, of the week, that more and more interaction between competition authorities and sectoral regulators are in progress in many fields. How to organize those relations, how to make sure that the competition standpoint is well reflected in the regulatory framework is something that we will look at. So thank you very much for being here, and I want to turn the floor over for this inaugural session to Mr. Dinoya, who is the director of DEFI, and is going to chair the proceedings.
Thank you, Frederick, and good morning to everyone here in the room and also those who are connected from remote. And let me join the chair in welcoming all of you to this 21st edition of the OECD Global Forum of Competition. And special appreciation to Secretary General Cormann and to our keynote speakers for this opening session, Executive Vice President Vestager and Secretary General Grynspan for taking the time also to be here with us today. Now, the OECD Global Forum on Competition was established in 2001. And it brings together high-level officials from more, as we heard, more than 100 competition authorities worldwide, including both OECD and non-OECD economies. Its main goal is to promote a wider dialogue about key competition issues and their interaction with other topics relevant for the overall economic development. This year, our discussion will go from broad topics, such as the goal of competition policy, to more practical issues, like the use of remedies and commitments in abuse cases. But before the start of our substantive sessions and to open this year's forum, I would first like to call to the podium the OECD Secretary General, Matthias Cormann. Matthias, please.
Thank you very much, Carmine. A very warm welcome to Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager, and also a warm welcome to Secretary General Rebeca Grynspan. It's Rebeca's second time at the OECD in just a week. Also, the Chair, Frederick, Jenny, ambassadors, colleagues, distinguished guests, friends all. Welcome to this, the 21st Annual Global Forum on Competition. This forum is a key platform for the global competition policy community to explore emerging issues and to strengthen international agency cooperation. Your discussion today on the goals of competition policy is very important because the world needs well-functioning and dynamic markets now more than ever. Russia's unprovoked, unjustifiable and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine continues to have a negative impact on global growth, on inflation, food and energy markets, and confidence is at its lowest level in many years. In many countries, we're seeing a broad-based rise in inflation to levels not seen since the 1980s. And households and firms are suffering as costs continue to rise and purchasing power is taking a hit. We must get global growth back on track, and effective competition is central to getting us there. We need dynamic markets to produce innovations, including, of course, to improve energy efficiency and conservation. We need open markets to keep food supplies affordable for low-income countries. We need efficient markets that keep the pressure on firms to cut costs and to avoid waste. And we need resilient markets with real choices for businesses, public procurement officials, and households to minimize supply chain vulnerabilities. Our analysis consistently shows that competition does not only improve economic growth in itself, it also makes it more equitable. Higher levels of market power, higher levels of market concentration can further reduce the wealth of the poorest, 20%, by between 14 and 19%. The competition agencies assembled here today have a central role in helping to ensure economies, communities, and consumers around the world can benefit from the positive impacts of competition. First, of course, by tackling anti-competitive conduct. In the current environment, this includes tackling the use of inflation as a cover for illegal price fixing, abusive conduct by firms to shut competitors out of markets can also create economic vulnerabilities, lead to higher prices, lower quality, and fewer choices. Second, through effective merger control. Mergers which alleviate the pressure on firms to innovate and keep prices low will undermine the dynamism of our economic recovery. Competition agencies then will need to keep a careful eye on acquisitions by dominant incumbents of their small, disruptive, and emerging competitors. Our economic growth depends on the innovations of these smaller firms and the pressures and incentives they create for incumbents to improve their products and keep their prices competitive and low. Third, through effective advocacy of pro-competitive policy. Competition policy is the thread that can weave industrial strategies, innovation, climate, energy, and trade policies together. It can guard against counterproductive policies that detract from, rather than harness, dynamic markets. And it can create the right alignment between investment and innovation incentives on one hand, and government's broader economic policy objectives on the other. For example, vibrant competition is the key to developing successful domestic firms that can compete internationally. And our economic resilience will also be best served through competitive public procurement processes and open global markets. The OECD recommendation on competitive neutrality, released last year, is a valuable tool for ensuring a global level playing field in achieving these objectives. In addition, our competition assessment toolkit provides a step-by-step guide for identifying unnecessary regulatory barriers to competition and pro-competitive alternatives to meet our competition policy objectives. Dismantling these barriers which prevent new firms from entering markets and which can even create incentives for collusion, should be a central component of any economic growth strategy. Looking ahead, competition will also support progress on our longer-term structural reform priorities. Digitalization, which I know has been a major theme of this forum's past work, offers massive benefits and opportunities for growth, for connectivity, and for innovation, which will only materialize in the context of truly competitive markets. Competition is needed to keep the prices consumers pay for digital products low, whether in monetary terms or through data collection and advertising exposure. And competition is also needed to ensure large digital incumbents do not rest on their laurels and continually innovate to provide new and better products. Globally, effective action on climate change will also require the innovative forces of the private sector. Private sector innovation and investment to develop new technologies and transform existing business processes will need to be at the core of our green transformation. This again requires well-functioning, dynamic and competitive markets. New greener firms must have the opportunity to grow, and market-based signals will be needed to incentivize efficiency. And effective competition will also help address some of the economic implications of population aging, given the need to boost our productivity to address some of the workforce participation implications of population aging, which pro-competitive reforms will help us to secure. I'm sure that I'm preaching to the choir here in this room. The role of competition, the role of competitive markets in supporting these objectives, I'm sure, is clear to all of us assembled in this room. But today you will also be discussing whether we should make a clearer, more explicit link in competition law to some other key policy objectives, or whether we can achieve what we need to achieve by reinterpreting current provisions. Policy objectives which include to promote sustainability, to tackle unfair conduct by large digital firms, to ensure workers get a fair deal in wage negotiations, and to protect the interests of small suppliers from undue influence of large customers. When considering any changes, policymakers should ensure, first, that competition is an effective mechanism for promoting the outcome in question. Competition on its own is not a solution for every policy challenge. Take inflation. As the Competition Committee discussed earlier this week, competition contributes to reducing long-run inflationary pressures and prevents anti-competitive behavior from exacerbating inflation. However, it should not be expected from competition agencies to solve current inflationary pressures in the short term, given some of the underlying causes, in particular, a series of highly exceptional supply shocks. Second, that trade-offs between the new objective and traditional objectives are clearly identified. For example, if mergers are assessed in terms of their impact on employment, policymakers should contemplate how this impact would be traded off against price reductions. Otherwise, competition agencies would be left with the challenge of determining, without guidance, whether consumers should forego lower prices due to potential job losses, for example. Third, that the objective can be clearly defined and assessed in competition law enforcement proceedings without introducing excessive uncertainty and subjectivity, which would be counterproductive. Vague provisions can undermine the ability of businesses to make commercial decisions and structure their conduct and transactions to avoid competition law infringements. Colleagues, this is a period of significant change for competition law. Entirely new digital sector regulatory frameworks are being implemented or proposed in several jurisdictions, most notably in the European Union under your leadership, Executive Vice President Vestager. Earlier this year, the OECD conducted a mapping exercise, mapping out the new competition rules being developed for digital markets across the G7. This work shows that jurisdictions are all motivated by the same concerns and the same objectives and are considering similar measures, but their specific approaches can vary quite widely. To collectively get the best possible results over time, in the best tradition of the OECD, open dialogue on lessons learned, on what has and what hasn't worked, and to identify evidence-based best practices will be important moving forward. So let me close by saying that in today's challenging and evolving economic environment, effective competition is as important as ever. The Global Forum on Competition is an unparalleled opportunity for competition agencies and policymakers to exchange ideas and experiences as we continue to look for the best pathway forward to navigate this complex environment that we're in. I wish you a very positive and very productive couple of days. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words.
Thank you, Secretary General, for your kind words about the forum and your insightful remarks on the importance of this year's discussions. The Global Forum was actually founded exactly as a means for OECD Competition Committee to reach even beyond its membership and encourage more cooperation, stronger connections between competition authorities. Because we really think that hearing about the experiences and the challenges of competition authorities can be highly beneficial, and it reminds us of the continuing importance of advocating for competition with policymakers, the business community, and the general public. So this year, in the face of unprecedented and pressing challenges, as Secretary General Corman just mentioned, and we had yesterday this very, I think, interesting discussion also on competition and inflation, there are very important things that the competition community can and must do. Competition authorities have reacted in many different ways and have faced challenges and experienced successes in doing so. And the European Commission has very valuable experience to share with us in this regard. So we are very lucky to have here today Executive Vice President for a Euro Fit for the Digital Age, Margrethe Vestager, who will share her perspective on this. So Executive Vice President, you have the podium.
Good morning, and thank you very much for welcoming me here, for being able to join this forum. I cannot think of a better home away from home. Not the OECD building, but the community. because we have something going for ourselves, something of crucial importance. I'm sure that the debates today and tomorrow, they will continue to be important contributions both to our dialogue about the work we do, but of course also inspiration in our law enforcement work in the jurisdiction where we serve. And I would like to start by thank the Competition Committee of the OECD for the ongoing work. I think that is a connecting point for many of us, and I think it benefits whether you're a member of the OECD or not a member of the OECD. This is a port to call. So thank you very much for this. And when I look at the themes that are chosen for the 3 sessions, I see one central question that connects them. As competition policymakers, where do our work fit in with other public policy objectives? This is by no means a new question. In fact, the question is as old as competition law itself. When the Sherman Act of 1890 was being debated in the US Congress, the discussions were completely interlinked with 3 main political questions of the day. First, how can government make sure that foreign companies compete on fair terms with US companies? Second, how to achieve sensible regulation of natural monopolies like railways? And thirdly, how best to tackle the rising poverty and growing inequality between rich and poor. As the French put it, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. On both sides of the Atlantic, I think on this planet, we are struggling with the same questions today. Thankfully, our institutions have matured. We have in place multilateral trade institutions. We have a common understanding that protectionism benefits no one in the long term. And at the same time, through decades of experience, we understand how to regulate sectors in a way that maximizes the benefits to competition while protecting the public interest. Finally, we have created social welfare systems, though I'd give you that imperfect, at least serves as a good foundation to tackle the poverty and the inequality that not only still exists, but in some places actually are increasing. But even as our policymaking has grown more sophisticated, the scale and the depth of the challenging that we faces, well, they have all become so much more complex. When the Sherman Act was signed into law, no one dreamed that a completely nascent industrial activity might one day reach a scale where our climate was under threat, requiring urgent and coordinated action across all countries on this planet. And this is far from the only threats that we are faced with. In Europe, we are faced with the weaponization of energy supplies by Russia. We're in a severe energy crisis. When the fighting is finally brought to an end, the devastation brought by the unjustified war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine, well, that will require a huge reconstruction effort. Something our competition policy toolkit will be called on to assist. And at the same time, we witness the continued unwillingness of global corporations to pay their fair share of taxes. And all of us, I think, have come to understand that if left unregulated, big tech can be a danger to our markets, to our democracy, and to the well-being of our societies. Caught between all these challenges, well, sometimes I guess it can feel that classical competition enforcement is boxed in. But that is not the case. Our core mission, preserving healthy competition in the markets where we serve, does not stand in opposition to other policy objectives. It is fully complementary. Actually, I'd go a step further. I'd say that in every meaningful sense, fair and contestable markets are a necessary foundation upon which other policies can build. We need the fundamentals to fight also the urgencies. First and foremost, this is true because a well-functioning economy ensure the stable tax revenue that governments need to address other challenges, such as funding social security, investing in digital skills and digital infrastructure, facilitating green solutions. And competition is a key part in making markets function well. This means jobs for those who are able to work. It means social support for those who are not. And free and fair competition is also needed for markets to set the right price. And without price signals, we have no way of knowing if public investments are well targeted. Competitive markets, they are more resilient to external shocks, giving us the internal strength that we need to withstand aggression from outside our borders. Competitive markets, while they generate productive efficiencies, they enable innovation to make our economy greener and stronger. And there is one final argument, because competition is inherently pluralistic. When markets have lower concentration, this spreads economic power much more evenly. Consumers can vote with their feet and with their clicks, while different voices speak from within the same sector. And this democratization of the marketplace helps us protect our values, helps us support our democracies. In media and online, it can help preserve free speech. This reflection, and I know it may sound trivial to you, but it is fundamental to us, and it has informed what we have been doing lately, actually every aspect of it, whether it's enforcing existing competition law or crafting new rules or updating existing procedures. In the digital sphere, the need for regulatory action, I think, is now universally recognized. And I think it's also recognized as one of the challenges that every government must face. And from a competition policy perspective, our first thought is how new regulation can work in harmony with our existing competition policy tools. The goal is not to put a brake on digital markets, but rather to shape these markets according to the principles of fair and free competition, making sure that the market stays open. And this is why the Digital Markets Act grew out of the experience that we gained in the past years of antitrust enforcement. And this is also why the Digital Markets Act was developed side by side with the Digital Services Act. Together, these two instruments, these two pieces of European legislation, they will come to shape the contours of the digital marketplace that operates in Europe. And these markets, well, they will be vibrant, they will be competitive, they will be fair. The same is true for the way we adapt our policies to take account of the new geopolitical order. Any moves to become more protectionistic eventually will fail. Not just because they invite to retaliation, but fundamentally because they will undermine our competitive foundations. So our response will have to be phrased in these terms. What changes are needed in order to keep our markets as open, as fair as possible? And this is why we, within the European Union, conceived the new foreign subsidies regulation. This is an instrument to create a true level playing field when it comes to subsidies. We want foreign investment within the European single market. Full stop. And the reason why we want it is that foreign direct investment is pro-competitive, because it helps to achieve all our complementary policy objectives. And by setting fair rules for how this investment can take place, we are in fact creating the foundation on which our market and our consumers can continue to maximize the benefits. This core objective is also behind every one of the many reviews and revisions we have taken to our guidelines and procedures. That work is not complete, by the way, we're still on it. In a sense, one could say, well, the best has yet to come. We just launched the public consultation on the draft revised market definition notice, and this will be the first revision since it was adopted back in 1997. In addition, our mainstay procedural regulation in antitrust, Regulation 1 of 2003, is subject to an ongoing evaluation. As part of this process, I would invite you to our conference of the 20th of June to mark the 20th anniversary of this regulation, so the procedural rules when it comes to antitrust. More information about that, of course, will follow, but maybe for some of you it is interesting to see what we have learned and where we want to take it. Because being the European Union and union built on the rule of law, of course that also comes to the way we enforce our antitrust rules. This brings me to the final point that I would want to make, and that concerns the tax practices of some countries that effectively account to little more than unfair subsidies being granted. And even if the European Court has ruled that such countries cannot be addressed on rules that are not fully part of their national system, there can be little doubt that the ability of some corporations to secure unfair tax advantages, that hurts fair competition. Most businesses, they need to work really hard to make a profit. From that profit, they pay their taxes. And they are faced with competitors who evade it. That is not fair competition. Insofar that we can get global corporations to pay their fair share, this will open new opportunities for competitors while forcing incumbents to focus their energies on innovation rather than tax avoidance. What is equally clear is that this thinking is fully complementary to wider policy objectives of fairness. Ending unfair tax subsidies protects the interest of taxpayers. And it's a step towards addressing rising inequalities, inequalities that are tearing our societies apart. After all, every euro given away as a tax advantage to a particular corporation is a euro that cannot be spent on roads, on hospitals, on broadband networks of educational efforts. And that is why I have applauded the work of the OECD to advance the issue and the cause of tax fairness. This is work well done. Of course, work well done needs to materialize in the real world, and here we still have a bit of push to do. I also believe that the result of the Fiat tax judgment that we just got from the European Court of Justice, our enforcement should continue within the clarified limits that the court would give us, as anyone would respect the limits set by our courts. But I should also say that our efforts have shed light on some of these practices and built momentum towards new initiatives, like the European Commission's upcoming proposal for a new corporate tax system. Just as our work in competition policy supports fairness, the tools that will achieve a bigger degree of tax harmonization and transparency, that will preserve competition. And that is the very essence of policy complementarity for the Digital Markets Act, for what we do on foreign subsidies, for what we do for tax fairness. And when the limits of our tools, they are reached, we learn from this and we develop new tools. And this is how we evolve, this is how we stay relevant, because we are in such a dynamic environment. But for us, the core philosophy, the core mission must never change. We're here to make sure that markets serve people. And because of that, our mission is to protect competition. It is as simple as that. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Executive Vice President Vestager, for this excellent presentation, also the nice words for the OECD work, and the relevant takeaways from the experience of the European Commission. So in the spirit actually of cooperation, the one that we mentioned across all the international community, we are also fortunate to have the contribution of UNCTAD Secretary General Rebeca Grynspan, and undoubtedly competition policy has a key role in economic growth and development. And so moreover, the discussion between the relationship between trade and competition, so with a particular focus on subsidies, actually will be also one of the central topics for our next forum for this year, for our forum this year. So for the OECD, recognizing the importance of the need for a level international playing field in a world characterized by different economic and trading systems is crucial to achieve economic development, growth, and productivity. As the Global Forum on Competition is a scenario where competition authorities from around the world gather, discussing the relationship between trade and competition in countries with different stages of development would be of significant importance for our participants. So, for all these reasons, we welcome very much the contribution from Secretary General Grynspan. She sends her regrets for being unable to attend, but has provided a video message for the forum, which we'll now present. So please.
Okay. Dear Matthias Cormann, Secretary General of the OECD, Margrethe Vestager, European Commissioner for Competition, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I want, first of all, to thank Matthias Cormann of the OECD for inviting me to this important forum. Matthias, it is great to coincide with you this often. I celebrate it. A strong UNCTAD OECD friendship will be instrumental to meet our shared goals. I have been asked to give a general overview of the situation the world is in while sharing some ideas on how competition policy can help in the current context. As you know, UNCTAD is the focal point within the United Nations system on competition issues. So today, I have the privilege of coming in representation of the whole of the UN and its membership. I will start with the context. We all share the view that the world is in a context of cascading crisis, marked by vicious cycles, cascading inequalities, and chronic instability. The war in Ukraine, a pandemic that is still not over, a changing climate that is hitting us harder every year, a cost of living crisis which is increasing poverty and hunger at alarming speed, rising interest rates which are dyeing up liquidity and increasing debt distress in the global south, and geopolitics, which is now in the driving seat of globalization. People are at the center of this cascade of crises. People who, shock after shock, have depleted their capacity to cope with disaster. People who are falling in record numbers into poverty. Children that are losing the right to education. Women that have lost their source of income. Countries that are facing debt distress. And most dramatically, people who are skipping meals. Acute food insecurity has tripled in 3 years. From 135 million before COVID to almost 350 million today, according to FAO and WFP. Heartbreakingly, over 1 million people are in a state of famine in 6 countries in the world: Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Haiti, South Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen. People are becoming increasingly disillusioned with their governments and political systems. In all, the UN Global Crisis Response Group, of which I am part, estimate that over 1.6 billion people in over 90 countries are currently in a state of severe vulnerability. So this is the context we are facing. It is perhaps the most challenging context any of us have faced in our entire lives. Given the magnitude of the problems, some would think that competition policy is just a drop in the ocean. But this is a mistake. In the current context, competition policy is very important, and for one profound and principal reason. At a time of rising fragmentation and distrust, each shock is bringing the rule-based multilateral system closer and closer to the breaking point. Fair, sound, and robust competition policies are a key line of defense to avoid this from happening, to safeguard our climate, to ensure future prosperity, to build resilience in our economies and societies, to avoid the negative effects to sustainable growth and innovation of market power and sheer speculation. We need competition policy. In particular, we need more and better competition policy in 3 key fronts. First, in enhancing enforcement against cross-border anti-competitive practices that harm the weakest economies and the most vulnerable groups. Here, the issue of taxation is paramount. The OECD Global Tax Deal must be implemented with haste. Second, in improving international cooperation to tackle highly concentrated markets, especially in the digital economy. UNCTAD research shows that 7 platforms in 2 countries represent over 90% of the market. Commissioner Vestager has shown in the EU the way in facing up to the digital giants. But the rest of the world is less powerful and less capable of doing the same. More cooperation is needed. And third and lastly, developing countries need more support to develop their own competition policy ecosystems, using international standards where possible, so that they do not fall off the path of robust, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth. This is an area where UNCTAD has been working intensively for many years now. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I hope and I trust that our organizations will continue to work together, joining forces to handle more effectively the challenges that lie ahead of us at this moment. I wish you all an engaging, very productive, and most importantly, a very impactful forum ahead. I thank you.
So thank you thanks to Secretary General Grynspan of UNCTAD, and now I would like to give the floor back to the chair of the OECD Competition Committee, Frédéric Geny, to lead all of us into the first substantive discussion of the forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. De Nooijer. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General, Ms. Vice President of the Commission. We are going to stop our proceeding for 5 minutes to allow our speakers to leave, and then we are going to engage into a discussion on the goals of competition policy, and I would like to invite the panelists to come here to the table. Thank you so much.
It's good to see you.
Very good to see you. I'm sure we'll see you very soon.
I just need to say hello to you.
How are you?
Great day for the law.
Huh?
Great day for the law. Where would you like it?
Anyway, they will put...
Okay. Wherever we are, they will put that.
Yeah, yeah.
This side or that side, doesn't matter.
Both. Esteban,
Hello, Esteban.
how are you?
Great to see you.
Very nice to see you. If you would take your seats, we are about to start for the first panel.
I like your bell, Fred.
Not terribly effective, but it's the intention.
The gavel next.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to start our first panel on the goals of competition policy. And at the start of this panel, I want to say that I feel rejuvenated. I feel like I'm much younger than I'm really young. There are two reasons for this. One of them is to see you all in this room, which is, as I mentioned earlier, warms my heart. But the second reason is that the debate we are about to have brings me back 25 years ago when there were already questions which were asked about what are or should be the goals of competition law and policy and how they should evolve. At the time, in 1997, Giuliano Amato, who was a politician and a constitutional law scholar, who had become the president of the Italian Competition Authority after having been prime minister in Italy from 92 to 93, published a book called The Bounds of Power. And this book, which did talk about the goals of competition policy, has lost none of its relevance to today's debate. Amato started from a constitutional law standpoint by saying that in democratic societies, there are two bounds that should never be crossed. One beyond which the illegitimate power of individuals arises, and the other beyond which the legitimate public power becomes illegitimate. Since ancient time, concentrated economic power has been considered to be potentially harmful to democratic institutions and norms, and therefore illegitimate. Political scientists have documented the harm that concentrated economic power, to the extent that it creates a gap between the haves and the have-nots, have done to democratic norms in many parts of the world, in Latin America among others, but also in other parts of the world. On the other hand, public power has been seen as illegitimate curbing of individual freedoms at times. As Giuliano Amato put it, it is a fact that within a liberal society itself, one of the key divisions of political identity, and hence identification, is between these two sides. The side that fears private power more, and in order to fight it, is ready to give more room to the power of government, and the side that fears the expansion of government power more, and is therefore more prepared to tolerate private power. So the dilemma of liberal democracies, as seen by Giuliano Amato, is therefore the following. How can private power be prevented from becoming a threat to the freedoms of others? But at the same time, how can power conferred on institutions for this purpose be prevented from itself engaging to the point of destroying the very freedoms that it ought to protect? Antitrust and competition law was, according to him, one of the instruments and one of the prime instruments used to solve this dilemma. And as the perception of the most important threat to liberal democracy shifted over time, antitrust and competition law were adjusted. To a large extent, the debate raging today about what the goals of competition law should be and the necessity to adapt antitrust, which is prompted by a perception of rising inequality, uncontrolled economic power of large digital platforms, which may threaten the political process, fits very well into the framework which was designed by Giuliano Amato. So we are, in fact, going back to the same questions. And we must be mindful that if we look back, there have been different conceptions about what is the proper equilibrium between the threat of too much state power or too much economic power due to concentration. The fact that competition laws are written in very general terms, by the way, and therefore allow a certain amount of flexibility is something that should help us in trying to adjust competition law enforcement and or concept of the goals of competition law to reflect the debate, the public debate about liberal democracies. We have known periods in the US, for example, when the goals of antitrust laws until the mid-60s were pretty wide, included the prevention of industrial concentration, the reduction of the influence of large firms, the promotion of individual liberty, the promotion of small businesses, and the creation of opportunities for entrepreneurs. In Europe, we have had the same kind of approach from the early 60s to the late 1990s. And at the time, there was a multitude of economic and socioeconomic goals which were assigned to competition law. Competition law was seen as an instrument for achieving most of the EU treaties' objectives, including the creation of an internal market, the protection of individual economic freedom, freedom of opportunity, fairness, employment, diverse microeconomic aims, the interests of society at large, consumer interest, efficiency, and innovation. Very wide perspective. Now, those times were followed by times where there was fear that government would overuse its power, and where there was an attempt to try to curb, to a certain extent, or to limit the extension of state powers. A more narrow interpretation of the goals of competition law came to be the dominant view. And the focus on consumer surplus was the central issue then. The idea was that encroachment of public power over private power was seen as politically less acceptable than it had been previously. Now, since then, there's been a growing concern in a number of countries about the increasing inequality attributed to insufficient control of the private economic powers, and the feeling that our economic system, fueled by competition, was unfair and worked for the elite and not for the masses. This has led to an increasing political distrust of government and a skepticism about the ability of the state to use its power to curb the abuses of private power. Hence, there's been a renewed interest, particularly in the US and in Europe, in the political debate for a more activist and wider focused enforcement of antitrust laws to try to rebalance what is seen as an unbalanced relationship between the power of the state and the private power. Now, the necessary political adaptation of antitrust enforcement can come from different processes. First, antitrust laws can be revised. Second, competition authorities can revise their guidelines, which give an indication of how they intend to enforce the laws. And third, the jurisprudence can evolve. Now, when laws cannot be easily changed through the political process, and when competition authorities are not at liberty to unilaterally change their interpretation of the law, a shifting political concern about the appropriate balance between public power and private power is much more difficult to translate into reality through the jurisprudence, at least in countries where the judiciary, either at the first level or at the level of review courts, is the ultimate interpreter of what competition law is about. In most countries, competition law is judicial or quasi-judicial process, and one crucial function of the legal process is to provide citizens with clarity and predictability about the interpretation of the law. Thus, it is easily understandable that judges may resist shifting interpretation of the goals of competition law or the existing laws in general, and that those urging a new alignment of the interpretation of the law with the political concern of the time may be frustrated by the slowness with which the judicial world reacts. However, this does not necessarily mean that judges are insensitive to the broader societal considerations which may be relevant to interpret competition law. And I will take two examples there. One of them is very well known. Justice Brandeis' promotion of living law considered it imperative for judges to adapt with changes in society. To evolve meant resisting the urge to stay rooted in the past, but instead to gain a broad education in the study of economics and sociology and politics, which embody the fact and present the problems of the day. For Europe, I would like to quote José Luis da Cruz Vilaça, who is a former president of the Court of First Instance of the European Communities, and who wrote fairly recently in a comment on the Intel judgment of the European courts the following: admittedly, the court is able to rely on a wealth of case law that serves as a guide and a beacon. Any departure from a well-established line of case law must be transparent, duly motivated, well-reasoned, and respectful of legitimate expectations. But in a fast-moving world, judges must also permanently listen to changes in the social, economic, technical, and political environment. How could it be different in the digital age, in a time of globalization, and in a knowledge and information-based society? So we can see that judges, even though they are very much attached to the predictability of the law, are not insensitive to those shifting ideas, as well as some of them promoted by technological change, on the respective roles of public power and private power. Let me conclude with this. I think that what this little narrative of going back in history tells us is that in all countries, competition policy and competition law enforcement reflect a fundamental dilemma of liberal democracies. This means that competition authorities are not only technical bodies in charge of protecting the welfare of consumers and promoting economic efficiency, but more broadly put in charge of promoting in the economic sphere the balance between private and public power, which will ensure that neither power will be seen as abusive. This task is all the more complex over time because various factors, whether technical, for example, the development of the large digital platforms, which can exercise undue economic and political power, such as the increase, or economical, such as the increase in income inequality, or political, such as the perception of unfairness of the globalized competition process, or the concern with the resilience of our economic system, may alter the perception of the appropriate balance between public power and private power over time. So we are at a time where there's a great tension and where speed is of the essence to see how we can adapt competition law to some of the new considerations which I've put forth and mentioned recently. This is going to be the focus of this panel. Now, to explore the goals of competition law and policy and how they can evolve, we are fortunate to have with us an excellent and impressive set of panelists. Spencer Weber-Waller, who's here, Professor of Law at Loyola University. Esteban Greco, who is to my right, Director of Games Economics and former head of the Competition Authority of Argentina. Lina M, next to Esteban, who's the chair of the Federal Trade Commission. Tembinkosi Bonakele, who's over there, who was the commissioner for the South African Competition Authority. Johannes Bernabe, who is next to him, the acting chair of the Philippines Competition Commission, and Mick Keogh, deputy chair of the ACCC in Australia. So we have a wide representation, and it is quite natural that the debate in each country may be different because, as I said, I mean, there's a political dimension to this debate, and we're going to try to compare notes along three lines. First of all, what are the goals of competition law and policy in your country? And is there a debate about it? And if so, in which direction does the debate go? Second, can we explore the complementarity or the contribution that competition law enforcement can make to other welfare-enhancing public policies? And third, how to implement competition law while being mindful of complementary welfare public policies in a coherent way and in a way which is going to provide the kind of legal certainty and predictability that a law instrument should have. So without further ado, let me turn to the first question. What is the debate? Is there a debate in your country about what the competition, the objectives of competition law are? And if so, what are the forces which are at play in the debate on this issue? And I will turn first to Spencer Weber-Waller to talk to us a little bit about the US and what he sees as the forces that are as the forces which are leading the debate in the US. Spencer.
Thank you, Fred, and it's an honor to be back at the OECD after too long and the intrusions of COVID in our world. So I'm thrilled to be here today. I am a professor at Loyola University of Chicago. I've had the honor this past year to serve as an advisor at the Federal Trade Commission, but I assure you that I'm here today in my Loyola, literally my Loyola hat as an academic. And so I'm only speaking about matters that are in the public record. I'm not sure really time is going to permit my going through the slides in any detail, but I'm going to give you some highlights and urge you to look at the materials that are on the website because of the time restrictions on all of us today. So yes, this is a time of passionate debate on the goals of antitrust, and there are so many different theories of antitrust that are being debated. And as Fred has alluded to, some of these theories relate to different visions of consumer welfare, whether it's total welfare, consumer welfare, a broader view of consumer welfare as relating to all market participants, notions of a competitive process, notions of unfairness. How do we address inequality and development needs? How do we protect and promote democracy? How do we support climate change? And I don't think it's odd at all that we're still having these debates more than 130 years after the introduction of national antitrust laws, at first in Canada and then in the United States. I've talked to colleagues who teach and work in other areas of the law, and I tell them that we're still arguing about what the purpose of our law is, and they just nod their head and they say, so do we. So we're not alone in this. But one of the reasons it's so important is that there are only in a few jurisdictions where the meta goals of the system are spelled out in the Constitution or the statute that all the agencies enforce and that the courts have to interpret. And while it is difficult to argue someone from one goal to another, just like Oliver Wendell Holmes said, it's difficult to argue a person into liking a glass of beer if they don't already do so. It's important that these goals be explicit and transparent, and that they evolve over time to meet the needs of the world as they exist. And also, it's important to talk about if you're going to change those laws, regardless of what direction the change is, and that may differ for each jurisdiction at different moments in time. It's important to think about, and I address in the slides later on, and I'll talk about if time permits, how to implement those changes, how to create lasting, if I read the tea leaves correctly in the United States, progressive change. How do you implement that and lock that into being? Of course, that would apply my institutional and other recommendations for how you make change would apply regardless of what that direction of the change is. So briefly, there are both external and internal forces that are shaping antitrust, and I think we're responding, as I mentioned, to not just one crisis, but many. And I think it is not appropriate that antitrust, and I don't think we can no longer say that our field of law can hide behind a purely technocratic approach. What we do makes differences in the real world, as all of our esteemed speakers have already talked about. We're responding to concerns about sustainability. Those concepts have been explored more thoroughly, in my view, in the US, but are beginning to infiltrate and affect the dialogue in the United States and elsewhere. Can we talk about inflation and use antitrust tools, competition tools to address? Can we address concerns about inequality and the needs of labor and the social and racial justice issues that have arisen in recent years, as well as the broad range of issues relating to the recovery from the COVID crisis? And I think all of this contributes to a questioning and a rejection of a sole concern about allocative efficiency, as most explicitly described as wealth maximization in Robert Bork's antitrust paradox. And as a result, we have internal changes, internal forces as well. We have, first of all, a generational change. The writings of Robert Bork are now more than 60 years old. This is not our antitrust. This is not even the antitrust of my father's generation. In some ways, it's two generations ago. And there's just different thinking. There's post-Chicago thinking, and there's sort of a growing view of antitrust back into its political economy roots. One professor who I admire greatly has talked about the political bargain of antitrust, where the idea was that we'd have more emphasis on efficiency and this would somehow affect all of us in a good way. And the problem is, in his view and others, that we have gotten the concentration, but we haven't gotten the efficiency and we haven't gotten the benefits to the general public. So this is a time for recognition and perhaps return to more of a holistic view of both the political and economic frame, and a recognition within economics that we have a concentration problem. And two very small examples from a US perspective. One is the wonderful work and the rich irony that the Stigler Center, associated with the University of Chicago, and a law and economics scholar of some renown from a prior generation, is now focused like a laser beam on the problems of monopoly and concentration, and has wonderful conferences and work product on that theme. The other is, if you are so inclined, there's a rich debate among all persons, but also very many progressive scholars, on antitrust Twitter. And that is a thing. And if you want to get a sense of the vibrancy of the debates that we're having about the goals of antitrust, that's just one of many places to get a sense in real time of how that debate is going on. And perhaps someone is live tweeting this conversation as we speak.
Thank you very much, Spencer, for framing the debate in the US. And let me turn, which is quite natural, to Lina for a view from the agency, from the FTC.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here with you all. It's an enormously exciting time for antitrust. As we've heard, the kind of end of history phase that antitrust had reached a couple of decades ago has now been thoroughly destabilized. And so the foundational questions that some had assumed had kind of reached an end state are now being revisited in a way that I think is enormously healthy for the profession. Antitrust conversations and debates in the US are no longer just the purview of a small number of economists and lawyers, but this is really something that now is routinely on the front pages of major newspapers. The other week, the mainstreaming of antitrust really entered a new phase where legions of Taylor Swift fans have now declared themselves anti-monopolists after confronting frustrations with the Ticketmaster interface and attributing some of that degradation of the platform to Ticketmaster's dominance. So it's an extremely dynamic and exciting time, and I think extremely healthy. Fred, when sharing the really wonderful trajectory over the last century, noted that, partly we've gone through different phases based on a contestation between public and private power, which I think is absolutely right. But I think, looking back over the last decade in particular, the real thing that thrust this debate forward was the fact that, in a very real sense, people were seeing in their day-to-day lives that the competition and the benefits that it was supposed to provide had not materialized. And so there's a very real empirical underpinning to what we're seeing. This is really about the lived reality that people are facing in their day-to-day lives, and I think that's where we are today, where people are feeling the lack of power in their daily lives, the lack of options, and recognizing that that's a result of policy decisions, including resulting from antitrust. As we also heard, the antitrust laws in the US have a rich history. They were passed against the backdrop of the robber barons and the industrial giants and the big trusts, and a real sense that the concentration of economic power that the Industrial Revolution had created was now posing not just a threat to people's material livelihoods, but also a threat to democracy. And I think that those are really the core values underpinning the antitrust laws. For the FTC, I think there's a more interesting question because there's a whole different statute, an antitrust statute, in addition to the Sherman Act that the FTC is charged with enforcing. So the Federal Trade Commission Act was passed along with the Clayton Act after lawmakers were extremely frustrated with how the Sherman Act was actually being interpreted in the courts. So the courts had basically adopted this rule of reason approach to the Sherman Act where they would engage in this balancing, and lawmakers thought that was inadequate. And so they passed the Federal Trade Commission Act and created the Federal Trade Commission as a way to both create a new institution, this body of experts that would also be along with the courts in the business of interpreting what this law meant and offering analysis of what the difference between fair and unfair competition was. I think that's a really important difference of the FTC Act, that the text of the statute prohibits unfair methods of competition. And that's something that we at the FTC are taking very seriously. There's been a retreat in the last few decades from really looking at this aspect of our mission. There had kind of been an effort to really enforce the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act and the FTC Act through a single set of values and goals, which I think erased some of the uniqueness of the FTC's institutional mission. And so one goal that we've been pursuing at the FTC is reactivating this unique authority that Congress charged us with, which is really about drawing the line between fair and unfair methods of competition. So just last month, we issued a new policy statement that basically excavates the history here, looks at the underlying case law, and offers an articulation of what this authority really means. And there are, a few key principles that emerge, but really it becomes clear that from a lot of the preceding interpretation, there were basic forms of coercion and exploitation that were recognized as being unfair methods of competition. It was recognized that there may be unfair methods of competition that violate the FTC Act that might not violate the Sherman Act or the four corners of the other antitrust statutes. And so the FTC was given additional flexibility in order to reach some of these unfair methods of competition. So we're taking very seriously the task of really reactivating and providing more definition to this unique authority. We basically have identified a few key principles in the policy statement. One is that the conduct must be a method of competition. And the second is that the conduct must tend to negatively affect competitive conditions. So it really must go beyond competition on the merits, and the statement gives examples of some of the types of business practices that we might be able to reach through this unique activity. I should also note that, in recognizing fairness and the prohibition on unfair methods of competition as a core part of the FTC's mission, we're not alone. Internationally, we've looked to counterparts, including in Japan and Korea, that have already led the way in thinking about issues relating to superior bargaining power and fairness and centering those in their regimes. And so that's also an area where we continue to look and learn as we develop this unique aspect of the FTC's mission in particular.
Thank you very much, Lina, for this. And let me turn a little bit as a contrast to Australia and to Mick, because I guess the sense that the debate in Australia is much less intense in a sense that it is in the US. And one possibility is, in fact, that there's been a recognition for a long time of a broader spectrum of goals for the competition policy. Mick.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here in this very important discussion. The goals of competition law in Australia have been subject to some discussion in recent times, although certainly not to the same extent as has been the case in other jurisdictions, such as the US. There are a number of possible institutional, political and cultural reasons that competition law goals have probably been less contentious. Perhaps part of the reason for this is that our competition legislation already adopts quite a broad approach in specifying its goals and objectives. Clause 2 of our legislation states, "The object of this Act is to enhance the welfare of Australians through the promotion of competition and fair trading and provisions for consumer protection." So it's fairly clear the intention of our legislators was quite broad, and that they believed that the welfare of Australians was best enhanced by fostering improved competition, while also seeking to ensure that businesses were protected from unfair trading practices and that consumers were afforded adequate protection. In the vernacular of some of the debate around the goals of competition policy, such a broad remit might be considered to be effectively analogous to total welfare rather than the narrower consumer welfare objective. In practice, however, most of the decisions the ACCC takes to give effect to the powers provided under our legislation have a primary focus on minimising harm to consumers. That is clearly the case when it comes to taking enforcement action for breaches of our consumer protection laws, which deals with such things as misleading advertising, unconscionable conduct, and goods and services that are not fit for purpose. However, our consumer protection laws also apply to situations where small businesses may be harmed due to breaches of consumer protection laws, which also afford protection from unfair practices to small businesses. The likely impact on consumers is generally our foremost consideration in our competition work, for example, in our assessment of mergers. In most instances, our assessment will consider whether the result will be a substantial lessening of competition in any market, as a result of which there will be a negative impact on consumers due to higher prices or reduced quality. In the case of mergers, however, our focus is not exclusively on the likely impact on consumers, but also on the impact of the proposed transaction on other participants in related markets. As an example of this, several years ago we opposed the proposed merger of two dairy processors, even though the outcome of this transaction was likely to be largely neutral for consumers, given strong competition in retail markets. The reason we opposed the transaction was that the two processors were the only processors competing for farmers' milk in several regions, and the result of the transaction would have been a loss of competition for milk at the farm gate. Our legislation also has a provision in it which is quite uncommon internationally, which enables the ACCC to provide an exemption for a merger or for proposed action that would otherwise be a breach of our competition laws. Under this provision, the ACCC may provide firms with an exemption from competition law, even if the proposed action or merger may result in reduced competition, but only if we consider the proposed action or merger will result in a net public benefit. What constitutes a public benefit is not defined under our legislation, and in considering this, the relevant appeal tribunal and our courts have stated that, and I quote, "We see public benefits as anything of value to the community generally, any contribution to the aims pursued by society, including as one of its principal elements, the achievement of the economic goals of efficiency and progress." So under this section of our legislation, firms can make application to the ACCC for an exemption for competition laws for actions such as cooperating together, which would normally be a breach of our cartel laws. Similarly, firms can also seek authorisation for a merger that may significantly reduce competition, but which they believe would deliver a net public benefit. Of course, our consideration of the likely net public benefit in such a situation would commence with the loss of competition as an important detriment against which any potential benefits would need to be weighed. And it is important to our note that our legislation requires that we must not grant an exemption unless we are satisfied in all circumstances that the public will benefit. So the onus is on the proponents to prove there will be a durable benefit. So we believe with such a broad set of goals and the flexibility that the exemption process provides us, we're able to deliver, or at least assist in delivering, some of the broader public benefits that the community seeks.
Thank you very much, Mick. Very precise analysis of the Australian situation and why, how flexibility is included into the law. So let me turn to Esteban to have a perspective both from developing countries but also from Latin American countries to see what are the prospects for flexibility in your laws.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. It's glad to be here again. Yes, let me, first I agree with that this discussion is very important and is important because it is giving relevance to competition policy as a public policy. But let me, the first, to deal with this first issue, add a developing country perspective and a Latin American perspective maybe, in my opinion. Maybe it's a provocative way to put it, but I think that the international current debate about broadening the goals of competition could be ignoring risks of this discussion and maybe in unintended consequences of broadening these goals without enough care. I think that over the time, competition law enforcement has evolved towards a greater certainty, legal certainty, considering as its main objective the protection of competitive process, economic efficiency, and consumer welfare. And these principles guide a lot of new agencies and developing country agencies' practices. How could we improve our practices? And this was a very important convergence principle to us. Developing countries characterized by lacking of a strong institutional framework, and in this framework we have to take into account how this broadening of competition law goals could impact. I think broadening these goals will imply discretion and legal uncertainty if we do not take enough care. And I think that we have two dimensions of competition. One is competition law enforcement, and I think the risks of broadening the goals are in the enforcement dimension of competition. Injecting policy trade-offs in antitrust cases and in M&A reviews could be a source of political pressure and maybe corruption. So, and legal uncertainty. Discretion is prone to increasing, also could have unintended consequences on competition, because discretion is prone to increasing power of traditional incumbents and crony capitalism. We call it capitalismo de amigos, capitalismo de cuates, maybe in Mexico. So this is a dimension that we have to take into account. I can give an example. Now there is a discussion on a draft guideline about merger regulations in Argentina, which include, taking into account this broadening of competition law goals, include benefits, how you can compensate anti-competitive effects of a merger, not only with efficiencies, but also with benefits over other aggregate goals as gender equality, care of sustainability of the environment, labor, and including import substitution. So I think this could put legal uncertainty to the process. So, and also this risk will lower investment and innovation, much needed in our countries, in developing countries. Legal uncertainty is difficult for these processes of investment and innovation. But trade-offs are in the competition policy dimension of competition. I think it's natural that public policies will have trade-offs, and I think there is much space for synergies between competition policy and other welfare-enhancing public policies. And, well, we can talk a little bit later about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Esteban. And I think that your observation is very interesting, that this debate, of course, must be seen in light of the institutional development of the country that we are talking about. And there is no reason why there should be a unique solution to what are essentially local political consideration and differences, of course, in the state, the institutional development of countries. So having said that, let me turn to other developing countries. I would like to turn to Johannes to give us a perspective from the Philippines on this issue.
Thank you. I think that being a relatively new competition agency is arming us with a bit of a blessing, and maybe from another perspective, a bit of a curse in having a relatively simple-minded approach towards this issue. In context, the Philippines is a country where political and economic power have traditionally been concentrated in the hands of a few. In many instances, these powers overlap and cross over to the other sphere, or at least allow for those entrenched convenient access between one and the other. In the political sphere, there's a recognition of this concentration, which prompted the framers of our Constitution to call for legislation against political dynasties. In the economic dimension, competition law is seen as the state's response, a measure that will curtail economic power, if not diffuse the same. This is because in a country of over 110 million people, there are only a dozen or so families or personalities which control the country's largest vertically integrated business conglomerates. These entities control, or at least influence, the most critical and lucrative stages in the value chain of many sectors, holding not insignificant market shares in these. And while they do compete among themselves, the capital and sometimes the regulatory compliance required to enter and become a viable competitor in industries they control, much less replicate the vertical conglomeration, are formidable. Competition law and policy is thus among a number of other more familiar goals associated with competition and reflected in our competition statute, seen by the ordinary person in the street as a means to discipline, if not prevent further agglomeration or accumulation of market power by conglomerates. In ordinary Filipinos' minds, the question we always face is, should not the Competition Commission be doing something to address the situation that economic wealth and power are in the hands of a few? It seems that for us to be relevant, there is an expectation in part that we have to diffuse pre-existing economic power. Obviously, there are significant challenges which a relatively new competition agency in a developing country at that faces in pursuing these goals. For one, we are taught by more mature and progressive competition jurisdictions and international best practice that dominance per se may not be anti-competitive, and that it is the abuse of such dominance that is repugnant to competition. However, the challenges in enforcing against abuse of dominance makes it seem Herculean for a scarce-resourced new competition agency to consistently succeed in this. Rather, it seems more tempting to avail of ex-ante means to discipline naked market power, whether it be through strict merger control or by seeking to work with sector regulators or other government agencies to promulgate a framework of do's and don'ts. Enforcement which provides for a real rule of reason analysis, as we do in the Philippines, also allows conglomerates a way out, as indeed, with their extensive resources, they are often able to leverage these to enhance efficiency and supply quality products in the markets they operate in to the short or medium-term benefit of consumers. And therefore, to my mind at least, in the Competition Commission, a more reasonable objective is not necessarily to restructure pre-existing markets in the Philippines, but really to create an environment which will allow other economic actors, including in particular small and medium-sized enterprises, which comprise 99% of all registered firms, to participate in select segments of the various value chains. I think this would make for a more sustainable competitive environment where the vast majority of enterprises are able to participate. And while we are not a price regulator, and competition authorities are often told not to be price regulators, I think that holding down prices to reasonable levels for the benefit of consumers equally lies at the heart of what we strive to do. So again, to my mind, being blessed with this simple-minded approach towards competition, it would seem to me that one, the onus is on us to really ensure that more businesses, particularly MSMEs, are able to latch on and become players in the different markets, if not in the different value chains. And second, that prices are kept at reasonable levels for consumers to benefit from the statute. Thank you.
Thank you very much for showing the dilemma, really, in which an authority in a very highly concentrated country faces, and how this informs, in fact, the priorities that the authority chooses, allowing challenges, so presumably fighting against barriers to entry on one side, to allow small and medium-sized firms to develop, and on the other hand, having a particular attention to prices, so to be seen as being working for the benefit of consumers. Now, let me finally turn to Mr. Bonakele from South Africa. It's well known that the South African law includes public policy objectives. How does that mix with the traditional orthodox view of competition law?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this panel. I'm really grateful that I am able to be here. I've had quite a long journey. The airline I used to go to Brazil, where I'm from, went via Paris and left my luggage here. I will not mention the airline. So when I came back from Brazil, connecting through Sao Paulo, they managed to leave my luggage again. And I can't help but wonder whether any competition policy or industrial policy is responsible for my misery. I should start by saying that the views I expressed are mine and are not necessarily those of the competition authority. And as many of you know, that I'm recently retired as the head of the agency. Neither are they views of the South African government. But if you ask me about whether there is a debate in South Africa on this, the answer is a definite yes. It is an evolving matter. And it's got its own history. The concern over monopolies in South Africa date back to the Dutch East India Company, which was granted a monopoly over the Cape, and the local Dutch farmers who had to supply refreshments to passing ships had to sell all their produce to this Dutch East India Company, which didn't have a monopoly only over trade, but also had a monopoly to maintain a military in the Cape, which led to a great trek to the hinterland of South Africa, where the Dutch farmers formed two republics. And as soon as they established the republics, they also started monopolies that were supplying the new mining industry that developed inland. That history is still important because the monopolies established, the beer monopoly, for example, supplying mine workers, is a beer monopoly that still exists today. And of course, we all know about the diamond monopoly, DBS, also dates back to this history. So, so the debate has been raging, and of course, in South Africa, had a racial dimension. So the black laundry suppliers to the mines were prevented from doing this and exclusively reserving that market for a laundry services that was white. By the end of apartheid, 1994, there were major concerns around the concentration of the economy. The largest conglomerate in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange controlled assets to the value of 43% of that stock exchange. And about 4 firms controlled just under about 85% of the market capitalization. And it was no surprise, therefore, that the new government's priority was to deal with concentration. And one of the policy instruments to do that identified was competition law. So such is the background to our act. And of course, the concerns were not just your classic competition issues. As I indicate, a big part of this was concentration, but also racial discrimination and generally exclusion. And so our competition laws included from the very beginning that for dynamism and growth of the South African economy, one would look at your sort of classic competition concerns, but also we were required to balance this against public interest. And public interest included employment, small and medium enterprises, participation of black people in the economy because of the previous exclusion, as well as the impact on industrial sectors or region. Just to give you an example, here we look for an example on what would happen in an industry that has, say, seasonal workers, where you have a merger. And how then we have implemented this, I think, is what has given rise to a considerable debate about whether competition law as a policy has had the desired effect. And I think with the concentration concerns, it is clear that there is overall dissatisfaction about the effectiveness of competition policy to deal with this. In fact, that has led to further strengthening of the Competition Act through further amendments to deal more directly with promotion of small businesses. And one of these provisions include the regulation of monopsony power, because this was also viewed as a major issue that the large conglomerates, whether they are supermarket groups and things like that, play a very big role in as a referee in the economy, as really a platform through which any entry, sustainable entry, had to be done. So monopsony power has become quite a big issue, as well as strengthening laws against abuse of dominance in the form of price discrimination. How we have done this in measures typically has involved imposing remedies to protect employment and often to protect suppliers. I think a famous example of these cases was the entry of Walmart into South Africa. There were no competition concerns about this entry, as Walmart didn't exist there, but there were major concerns around the displacement of local suppliers and them being replaced by the global supply chains of Walmart. The competition authorities and the courts confirmed the correctness of these imposed remedies requiring Walmart to establish a firm to assist local suppliers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that it's also true that in South Africa there were guidelines which were published by the Competition Authority to explain how it would take into consideration the public policy objectives of the law, and that this introduced a certain level of predictability of the decision, which was one of the issues that could have been concerning the business community and the judges. So I think that this practical way was very welcome by the community. Okay, let me turn now to the second part of this. So if we take a wide view of welfare, there are a lot of issues such as employment, sustainability, gender equality, financial inclusiveness, etc., which probably contribute to the welfare, at least in a general way, not the narrow consumer welfare, but the welfare of citizens. And one of the questions is whether competition law enforcement contributes to those goals, irrespective of whether those goals are written into the law, but just because what competition authorities do actually has an impact on those. So let me start with Esteban. So you said that you were a bit reserved about the introduction of public policy goals in competition law. But that doesn't mean, however, that competition decisions cannot answer some of those wider concerns.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. I think it is important we listen today to Matthias Korman and Margrethe Vestager talking us about the importance of competition policy as a foundation for a healthy market economy, and I think these are long-term benefits of competition on the economy and on society. But we can also think of examples of synergies, because competition policy and competition law enforcement can have positive externalities on public interest goals, and I can show you some examples from Latin America. Maybe we can show my presentation if everybody wants to see it. I have a couple of cases that are very appropriate because are cases of football and soccer markets, and in the context of the FIFA World Cup is a very good example to give you today. There are a couple of cases of Mexico and Colombia where there were investigations in football markets. For example, a case of COFECE in 2021, where there was a case about, let me go there, here. We have here there is a collusion between different football teams or clubs, and this was an infringement where there were caps on female players' salaries and also segmenting markets. So the action of the agency here had positive effects, not only on labor markets conditions, and also in gender equality. Also in Colombia, there was an investigation. This is still open, but is in this market about no-poach agreements and infringements in labor markets that has positive effect on labor market conditions. Another COFECE case that I think is very important about competition role in advocacy of the agency, but also with positive effects on environmental sustainability is a case where the agency had a very active interventions, trying to impede or criticizing and making statements against some regulations that could have exclusionary effects on solar and wind electricity generators. We have a case in Brazil from CAGI, where there was an investigation of collusive conduct in healthcare markets in Sao Paulo. This is also an example of a case with positive effects on employment and labor market conditions. There is a case in Argentina that I had the opportunity to enforce that had very different actions, competition advocacy actions, and also antitrust investigation actions, with recommendations to regulators that was implemented about opening up financial markets, and an investigation with, that ended with remedies, structural and behavioral remedies, to opening the financial market to fintechs. This was a key case because after this case, the financial services, mainly digital payments services, began to be very much competitive, and there are now a lot of fintechs and new services and innovations. And this case was very important to improve financial inclusion and allow many consumers that previously did not have access to financial instruments and services to enjoy these services. So also we can see a very important study from the World Bank, a study that took an analysis of many years of enforcement in Latin America, and this study showed that at least 21% of the cartels detected in Latin American countries involved in essential products such as sugar, toilet paper, wheat, poultry, milk, medicines, that directly and especially and disproportionately affected poor households. So the enforcement of competition policy in these markets have very positive effects on vulnerable households, and also on distributional equality and improving income equality. So I think these are some examples of this kind of synergies that we can find in competition cases.
So thank you for this. This is very reassuring to see that, first of all, competition, as traditionally interpreted in a number of cases, can have a positive effect on some of the wider social goals, such as reducing inequality or promoting gender neutrality, etc. So that does give an indication, by the way, to competition authority that the prioritization of cases which may have a wider impact than just the narrow competitive impact may be useful. I mean, the selection of cases that may have a wide social significance may be very useful. So let me turn to Johannes and to the Philippines and ask the same question. I mean, the extent to which, I mean, you have.
Thank you, Professor Jenny. I will hark back to my earlier intervention with regard to our prioritization of MSMEs and how we try to forward the participation of these enterprises in the mainstream market, particularly in the context of a situation where there are conglomerates which are vertically integrated and which might be difficult to compete against for a number of these smaller players. I think that to create the environment that would facilitate the entry or the ability for MSMEs to compete, a multi-pronged strategy would be indispensable. And I think this resonates with many other countries who may have a preponderance of MSMEs in their economies. And this would consist of three things. The first is an effective enforcement strategy. Second would be a sustained and proactive advocacy effort. And the third would be regulatory review and reform. There's nothing new about what I'm saying, but I think that the reason, therefore, is because these are what would prove to be effective and what has been empirically proven to be effective in other jurisdictions as well. In the case of the Philippines, the enforcement activities that have to be engaged in will have to be even more eagle-eyed because of the conglomerate nature of the economy that I was referring to earlier. Otherwise, if preference will be accorded or continue to be accorded to large players' affiliates, the ability and incentive for other players to participate, particularly MSMEs, would be diminished. As things stand, these enterprises contribute just 36% of value added to the economy, which is significantly lower than, for instance, our ASEAN neighbors, Indonesia's 53% and Vietnam's 39%. While we have, over the past 5 years, sought to more effectively enforce against dominance or other anti-competitive conduct or behavior, we have tended, as been advised to us as a young competition agency once again, to go after low-hanging fruit and simpler cases to gain experience for our enforcement staff and to establish credibility among the business community. The courts, of course, also have to be further won over in terms of their judicial review of decisions we have to make. But I think time has come for us to evolve, to investigate more difficult vertical agreements and dominance cases. Tying and bundling arrangements, conditions which have no relation to the main products or service sought to be supplied, seem to litter agreements relating to participation in the production and supply value chains. I would know of this because as a previous private practitioner, I was also privy to drafting some of these exclusionary practices as well. Of course, now that I'm wearing a different hat, I see these as in large part constraining MSME's ability to integrate or sustain integration into these value chains. Another vector which has to be pursued, as I mentioned, is a more engaged and sustained advocacy targeted towards MSMEs. Again, while they comprise 99% of all registered firms in the country, if you survey the level of awareness of MSMEs, in our country, for medium-sized firms, only 16% are aware of the Competition Commission, and 14% of the small enterprises know about competition law. And if you probe a little bit more deeply as to this level of familiarity, you'll find out that their actual knowledge or working knowledge of these law and institutions dives down to 9% on average. So if we are to empower MSMEs to be more vigilant about practices that they contend with and be able to file cases before the Competition Commission, then even the relatively intensive advocacy programs that we have now have to be enhanced further so that more MSMEs are aware of their rights and possible causes of action. And then, lastly, from a policy and regulatory framework, licensing requirements and procedures have to be reviewed and revised where necessary to be less anti-competitive. The burdens of compliance obviously tolls more heavily on smaller MSMEs with their shallower pockets relative to large enterprises who have the ability to hire counsels and economists. Time and much worse delays in securing permits weigh much more heavily and act as unintended barriers to entry or expansion of firms imposed by the government. Recently, we have succeeded, however, in promulgating a national competition policy which requires a government-wide assessment of all implementing legislation and regulations which may have an adverse impact on competition, failing to do which staff and officials of these agencies will not be entitled to certain year-end bonuses. And so we believe that this is an effective disincentive for them to fall short of conducting this competition impact assessments. Of course, this also puts the onus on the PCC and the Philippine Competition Commission to train our colleagues in government to conduct this competition impact assessment. Coupled with recent legislation to facilitate ease in doing business by having fixed shorter time frames, failing to abide by which agencies must deem approved any application for license, facilitates the ease of doing business in the Philippines. Hopefully, with all of these initiatives, there will be very positive and constructive steps towards ensuring that MSMEs contend in a friendlier regulatory environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent examples of different types of actions that can be undertaken. Of course, the statistics that you gave about the awareness of competition law is concerning, but the hope is that those type of actions are going to change those numbers and increase them dramatically. Let me turn to Spencer for a perspective.
Thank you, Fred. In part, Fred asked me to direct my comments toward antitrust and democracy, perhaps in part because I had the chance to speak on this theme a number of years ago before COVID to the OECD. And I think we're talking about two different things. I think you've actually heard a wide degree of agreement that at a broad level, antitrust and democracy go hand in hand, from the first speaker on the sort of keynote panel to all of us here. And I just think that's true. And I wanted to give you just a quote from a ringing praise of the role of antitrust and democracy in the American system from a person you wouldn't expect. Little surprised then that in America's antitrust, America's free enterprise tradition, no less than its political tradition, we deeply distrust concentrated power. We distrust the intervention of the state, to be sure, but we also cast a weary eye on powerful private entities. We have little tolerance for the monopolist who secures his position anti-competitively. We offer no quarter to the naked cartel. In other words, we no sooner trust concentrated private power than concentrated public power to dictate the directions of our economy. And that's ringing language that I would have been proud to be that speaker, but I wasn't. It's in fact the late Orrin Hatch, who is a very conservative Republican senator who shares the same kind of general values that many of us do about the importance of this, but would frankly favor a very different technical day-to-day enforcement of the antitrust laws as to what he would think is a problem from this perspective. And so I think really the question is not the external meta level. The question is, how do you operationalize this? And I was particularly struck by Esteban's slides about how you have these positive externalities was a very nice way to put that. So I would say that the overall goal is to use technical expertise that must also be accountable politically to the public. It must be transparent, it must be procedurally fair, and it must make sense to the general population. And I would suggest some parameters to ensure that. One is focus on the necessities. I'm not sure if this is what you meant by low-hanging fruit, but focus on things that matter to the public and matter to the economy as a result. Things like food, fuel, transportation, construction, pharma. These are things that across many societies, we have a competitive problem and speak to the, we would call it in the United States, sort of kitchen table issues that people understand and understand why it's important. The next one is a little bit harder to convey, but the idea is punch up, don't punch down. I don't believe there is such an investigation pending anywhere, but if there was one involving if there was a cartel for yacht brokers that artificially inflated the price of mega yachts sold to the ultra-rich, that's probably a violation of antitrust laws in most jurisdictions. To the extent you can choose prioritize the things that hurt those who can least protect themselves rather than those who have access to lawyers, can sue for damages if they've been harmed, or exert power at the bargaining table to prevent from being exploited. For example, when I mean kitchen table issues, let me just see if I can find one of the slides that gives the best example at a time of great change in the United States in the late 1930s, when Thurman Arnold was brought in to revitalize antitrust enforcement after the failure of the aspects of the New Deal during the Great Depression. If you look particularly on the right-hand side of the slide, one of the many ways Arnold revitalized antitrust enforcement at the Justice Department was by bringing cases that were the kitchen topics, table topics of the ordinary public, and was relentless in promoting this in front of Congress, in the media, in his own writings, by both symbolically and effectively trying and representing the government in many of these cases. What mattered in the 1930s, from a point of view of what cost too much or had other restrictions? Automobiles, movies, dairy, tires, newsprint, steel, fertilizer, even something as seemingly unimportant as those little wooden sticks that you have ice cream bars and popsicles on. But people understand what that is. Gas stations, even if they were just in the District of Columbia, where you didn't have to worry about interstate commerce issues, people understood the gas of gasoline, as we all know. He attacked international cartels and other kinds of things. And again, he made his case relentlessly to the media. When I talked about punching up and not punching down, address the needs of actual consumers who can't protect themselves. Let people who can, generally speaking, protect themselves within the boundaries of the law. And I would say don't pick on the helpless or the hapless if you can avoid it. There are people who engage in violations of the antitrust laws that if you have the ability in your system to prioritize going after the things that matter, not the minor things that are technical violations. I can give you an example. Back 30 years ago, there was government antitrust enforcement against a group of lawyers who represented indigent defendants and were paid by the public in Washington, D.C. The price they were being paid at was abysmally low, which affected their ability to effectively and constitutionally represent the poor in criminal offenses. And as a result, they engaged in a boycott. They got a higher price out of the D.C. City Council. In all likelihood, the Supreme Court correctly analyzed this as a per se violation, but I just wonder why it was brought in the first place. And so, again, prioritize cases that help those who can't help themselves. Avoid prosecuting the people who are at the wrong end of the stick of market power when you have the discretion to do so. And that is some suggestions that I think that can help operationalize the broad agreement about the role of antitrust and democracy and put it in concrete terms. And it also highlights something that I do want to talk about if time permits, which is talk to the public. And to talk to the public, as Johannes was talking about, you have to talk about things that matter to them and that they understand. And again, the more kitchen table, the more you will find that the general agreement of what we'll call civil society. Talk to the law professors, of course. Talk to the lawyers, of course. Talk to the business people, but talk to the people in general who will support and understand what you're doing, and you're, again, moving the ball forward toward a big level picture of democracy and, let's say, a smaller day-to-day enforcement strategy. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Australia and to Mick and another tool which is quite useful, which may be market investigations as a way to bring a wider perspective to the competition issue.
Thank you. Yes, in the experience of the ACCC, there is a great deal of complementarity between our market inquiry powers, which are a power given to us under our legislation, our enforcement work, and the achievement of broader socio-economic policy objectives. Having said that, there are also many situations where competition or consumer law is not an appropriate vehicle to achieve broader public policy outcomes. And desired outcomes are best achieved through specific legislation in areas such as the environment, education, public health, etc. Where there is a public policy issue that requires a response, and there is some indication that market failure may be a contributing factor, Australian competition and consumer law provides for a government directive to the ACCC to conduct a market inquiry into the matter. A directive from government to the ACCC to conduct a market inquiry brings with it a commitment of additional resources from the government to carry out the work. Such directions may only be given by a treasurer and arise in situation where there is a recognised market failure with significant public policy implications. Recent examples have included ACCC inquiries into the dairy sector, into water markets, and to digital platforms. We are about to commence an inquiry into the market for childcare services. In the case of both the dairy and the digital platform inquiries, the information obtained during the course of the inquiry provided evidence of breaches of competition or consumer law which led to successful enforcement action. For example, information obtained during our digital platforms inquiry led to the ACCC taking enforcement action against Google for misleading consumers about the control they could exercise over the use of their location data generated from the use of Android phones. The courts imposed a $60 million fine on Google for this breach of the Australian consumer laws. For all three of the inquiries I mentioned, the findings included recommendations for significant law reform, and in each case these reforms have subsequently been largely implemented by government. The digital platforms inquiry identified significant market failure in relation to the use of news articles generated by journalists to attract the attention of consumers to digital platforms, where that attention could be monetised via advertising. The Australian government subsequently legislated the News Media Bargaining Code, which aims to address the market power imbalance in negotiations between the digital platforms and news media organisations for the use of news media content by digital platforms. It has subsequently been reported that over $200 million is being paid annually to Australian news media outlets for the use of their news articles, and this contributes to a stronger and more resilient news media sector in Australia, with subsequent public benefits in the form of more objective scrutiny of governments and corporations and a stronger democracy. This and other examples that have arisen in Australia highlight the important synergies that arise in relation to the market inquiries by the ACCC, our enforcement activities in relation to competition and consumer law, and subsequent beneficial outcomes in relation to public policy. Through rigorous and careful inquiries focused on market failures and the development of carefully considered reform proposals, the ACCC is able to assist governments to achieve desired public policy outcomes, while at the same time improving the competitiveness of markets and subsequent national welfare benefits.
Thank you very much. So examples of using this instrument to solve an issue which is very much a source of concern for the integrity of the political system. Let me turn to South Africa and to Tembi back, because I think that the Competition Authority of South Africa has been quite effective, in fact, implementing some of the suggestions that Spencer had, and to make to participate in the debate on the wider social goals of the country.
Thank you, Chair, and you must just stop me if my time is up. I have a few of these cases, and I'm quite passionate about all of them. We did a very interesting case a couple of years ago, which really made the Competition Authority in South Africa a darling of the people. We uncovered a major cartel amongst the 4 major baking companies in the country that controlled a large part of the market. They didn't just cartelize the market for bread, they were also vertically integrated into flour. So if you wanted to opt out of buying bread and wanted to bake your own, you were hit by the flour cartel. We managed to get settlements against 4 of these companies that admitted, and at the time we got record fines. The only company that did defend itself was subjected into an even higher fine, but most importantly, the trial itself enabled us to really lay bare the activities of the cartel, which is really what led to this very positive reporting about the work of the agency more generally. We then also, a couple of years ago, addressed what was quite an important issue in the healthcare sector. South Africa had a huge burden of HIV/AIDS, and at that time, this, as it is today, had to be managed with drugs that are mainly manufactured in the West, the US, and Switzerland. And we had a case, a complaint of excessive pricing, but also exclusionary conduct against one of the suppliers of these drugs. And eventually, I suppose also through public pressure, they did settle on the basis that they would allow licensing of the manufacturing of generics, which led to a price drop of about 90% for these drugs, leading to what is today the largest number of people on treatment for this disease. And as you know, drugs have essentially eliminated the threat to life, loss of life, and also has had this had a huge impact on the fiscus, because these drugs are bought by government, and it also led actually to the creation or growth of the pharmaceutical industry in South Africa. The largest pharmaceutical company in South Africa owes its existence and growth to this settlement. And we also had a recent case which we deliberately invoked the provisions of the Constitution on access to health care. Traditionally, the antitrust statute is not interpreted in view of human rights, socio-economic rights in particular. And we had a measure where we blocked a hospital a measure on the basis that it was going to affect access. We did show that the prices were going to increase, and there were uninsured patients who would be affected by this, and we invoked directly the provisions of the Constitution relating to access to health care. And this was upheld by our courts. As I said, I have many examples of these, but time permitting, I'll come back to some of them. Thank you.
Thank you for those very illustrative examples that you have given. Let me turn to finish on this part of the discussion to Lina, and to ask whether in the US antitrust cases whether there are examples of antitrust cases that enhance other public policies and therefore contribute to kind of a general perspective on welfare.
Yeah, happy to weigh in on that. So there are a whole set of examples I could offer, but I thought it would be useful to home in on one relating to labor and the welfare of workers. This is an area where Congress has passed a whole set of laws separate from the antitrust laws that are designed to provide workers key protections, including protections that give them the right to collectively organize, but also all sorts of rights that basically guarantee for them certain minimum protections. Over the last few years, there's also been increasing attention to the way that antitrust enforcement in particular can also help advance these goals. And so we at the FTC have been taking on some of that work as well. I should note, this is a really interesting intersection area, given that originally the antitrust laws were actually weaponized against workers shortly after the antitrust laws were passed, and then it basically took Congress having to craft an exemption in the Clayton Act that said the organizing activities of workers are not the type of collusion or cartel behavior that are supposed to be the subject of the antitrust law. So we've kind of long seen periods in which antitrust was attempted to be used against workers. I'll also say, historically in merger enforcement, unions and labor have, in some instances, actually come out in favor of the merger when they end up kind of getting certain commitments. And so this isn't always just a singularly one-directional complementarity. I think there can be certain tensions, but we in our work at the FTC are thinking about areas where there could be complementarities. There are a few areas that we're focused on in particular. One is thinking about merger enforcement and how we can be crafting our merger investigations to be recognizing whether certain transactions may be lessening competition in ways that would be harming workers in labor markets. Earlier this year, the FTC challenged a hospital merger in Rhode Island, and as part of that investigation, our team also investigated, in addition to potential harm on consumers and patients, whether the transaction would have limited competition in ways that would have hurt registered nurses. And so we are continuing to build the muscle of investigating harm to workers. This is also a key feature of our revision of our merger guidelines. We asked a whole set of questions, trying to better understand how we can more effectively operationalize this goal of conducting merger review with an eye to a whole set of trading partners, including workers. We are also thinking about activating our competition rulemaking authority. So this is an authority that would allow us to craft market-wide rules. There are a few potential contenders, but one that's been talked a lot about in the US is a potential rulemaking relating to the use of non-compete clauses and non-compete agreements that basically restrict workers from being able to go to other employers after they leave their current employer. There's been a whole set of empirical work showing that the use of these non-competes have been really proliferating and applied in all sorts of contexts, including in the context of low-wage work, including in the context of fast food work, areas where some of the traditional justifications that you've heard for non-competes, including relating to trade secrets and other types of confidential information, really don't apply. But we've also seen the use of non-competes across the board in ways that could be harming competition more generally. And so we're thinking about whether to deploy our rulemaking authority to address that practice. We're also using our policy tools as well as our advocacy and amicus opportunities to be advancing an approach to competition that is complementary with promoting worker welfare. So we recently filed an amicus brief along with the Justice Department looking at this issue of whether franchise restrictions that limit store owners from hiring workers away from other franchisees, whether that's something that's anti-competitive. And so we filed an amicus brief with the court saying that yes, that is anti-competitive. And we're also really deepening our relationships with other regulators and enforcers that are more on the front lines of these issues. So we entered into a memorandum of understanding with the National Labor Relations Board, which is really on the front lines of enforcing the law that give workers key protections to organize and collectively bargain. And so through this recent agreement we've reached with them, we're able to share information, including relating to investigations. We're able to share expertise, and again, really make sure that we're able to pursue this work in a complementary way. Lastly, I'll note we're thinking about how we can use our competition work in tandem with our consumer protection work to also be advancing these goals. We recently put out a policy statement relating to gig work, noting that there are a whole set of practices alleged in the context of gig platforms that could be potentially running afoul of the antitrust laws in ways that harm workers, but also potentially running afoul of consumer protection laws. And so traditional consumer protection violations like deceptive claims about how much somebody can earn through a business opportunity, for example, is something that we've heard about in the context of gig work. We're also looking at practices relating to algorithmic discrimination or the use of automated technologies in ways that could be amounting to consumer protection violations, but in ways that are harming workers. Before I arrived at the FTC, one of the cases brought under my predecessor related to the way that Amazon was actually deceiving consumers and workers relating to the tips that were being provided to its Amazon Flex workers. So that was an instance in which traditional consumer protection authorities were deployed to protect these workers. And so pursuing this work in an interdisciplinary way, given our dual mission of competition and consumer protection, is something that we are honing in on as well. So these are just a few of the examples of how we think that antitrust enforcement and competition policy, as well as some of our other tools, can be used in a way that are complementary with broader policy and legislative goals that are designed to protect and promote workers.
Thank you very much, Lina, for those examples. I mean, we've covered quite a bit of ground, and the first two parts of this roundtable have basically assessed the fact that there is a debate about the scope of goals that competition law should have in a number of countries. That was for the first part of the discussion. We saw that there were positive and negative reaction to this social demand, or at least there were risks in some countries, but there were also interesting experiences in others. And the second part of the discussion said, well, when we do our traditional approach to competition law, we in fact can cover quite a bit of ground in being complementary to some of the social policies. And we've taken example in health, equality, fighting concentration, labor relations, fragile consumers. So there were a lot of things. So in a sense, we could stop here and say, well, you know, what we do is great. I mean, it's just complementary to other policies, so there is no real problem. Nevertheless, there is going to be a third part of the roundtable, which is going to raise the following question. Besides choosing the cases which are the most relevant to society, is there also something else that we could do? Maybe look at competition issues not necessarily with different goals, but in a different perspective to try to have more of an influence on those general goals. So what are the suggestions that exist in this respect? And I would turn to Lina again, because I think that you want to emphasize the idea that taking a holistic view of competition enforcement may be a way to indeed diffuse the effect of competition law enforcement in society.
I think that's absolutely right, but I also would underscore that the question of which cases you choose and don't choose can't be overstated, that the importance of prosecutorial discretion, to go back briefly to the labor question, one area where we did see some antitrust enforcement that I think was in deep conflict with some of the other broader policy goals that Congress has been looking to advance was in instances where, we've seen across the board what's called a fissuring of the workforce, where traditional workers that would have traditionally been hired as employees are now instead employed as independent contractors. And so given the ways in which the US labor laws are crafted, they cover certain protections for employees, but don't provide those protections for independent contractors. And so this leaves a bit of a gap where even though the antitrust laws can now no longer be used to go after organizing by employees, it can still be used to go after organizing and collective bargaining by independent contractors. And so a few years ago, when we saw efforts by Uber drivers and Lyft drivers to collectively organize, they were not shielded by those antitrust protections, and we did see, unfortunately, some efforts to use antitrust laws to go after those types of collective organizing, even though it was very much in parallel with some of the broader goals of the laws protecting that type of collective bargaining and organizing. So just to underscore the importance of which cases you pick, but also the cases you don't pick is extraordinarily important. And I think this also goes to Spencer's point about punch up, don't punch down. I'll say more generally in the US right now, the Biden administration has been promoting what they're describing as a whole of government approach to competition policy. So this is responding to the fact that in sector after sector and market after market, we have seen a diminishing of competition, and there's now a recognition that as much as the DOJ and the FTC might try to do, this increasingly looks to be a systemic problem that requires all hands on deck. It also recognizes that there are a whole set of other enforcers and regulators that have tools and authorities and policy levers that are already in the business of structuring markets and designing competition. Those regulators and enforcers might not look at their policy tools in that way, but providing them with that framework and providing them with that lens and encouraging them to work with the FTC and DOJ can make sure that some of this work is again done in collaboration and in a complementary way. We already work very closely with certain enforcers when we are reviewing particular mergers. So for example, when the FTC reviews mergers in the defense industry, we work very closely with the Department of Defense. Earlier this year, we challenged the merger of Lockheed and Aerojet, and key to that challenge was a very, very close relationship with the Department of Defense, who was able to provide us with certain types of information. Of course, it's the US government that is often the biggest customer of these defense companies, and so they end up being a key witness. But beyond that, there's also now a recognition within the defense community that the degree of consolidation that has been permitted in the industrial base is now also posing national security concerns. So the Defense Department itself is now looking to competition policy as an important tool to promote their own goals. There are other areas where we've seen similar efforts. So the US Department of Agriculture traditionally was given this statutory authority that was designed to promote competition in poultry and livestock markets. So Congress had recognized that in poultry and livestock in particular, there can be a deep imbalance of power between farmers and the handful of processors that they end up being dependent on to get to market. And so USDA, the Department of Agriculture, was given a particular statutory authority called the Packers and Stockyards Act, where they were supposed to basically ensure that these dominant meat packers were not abusing their market power in ways that would hurt the farmers. This is an authority that had fallen into disrepair and disuse over the last few decades, and so the USDA is now as part of this whole of government approach to competition, thinking about how they can reactivate that tool in ways that would be very complementary to the goals of antitrust. The last example I'll highlight is a recent effort by the Food and Drug Administration to issue a rule that would allow for the sale of hearing aids without a prescription. So traditionally and previously, hearing aids could not be purchased over the counter. You had to go get a prescription, and that basically erected certain barriers to entry in the market. This rule now by the FDA has changed that, which is really injecting already a whole set of competition and hopefully innovation into this market, and we can imagine the price of hearing aids falling by around, I believe the estimate is somewhere between $2,000 to $3,000. So again, providing very material benefits to people, and that's something that has been achieved through a separate set of authorities outside of the four corners of the antitrust laws, but again, promoting very similar goals. I guess I'll just say lastly in this question of, how do you implement competition law along with other policy goals in a coherent way? I think at a basic level, it requires a couple of things. One is, where possible, clarity from policymakers in Congress about the domains in which values need to dominate and govern in which domains, so that for the most part it's not left up to the enforcers to be deciding this, but really it's up to Congress to be saying, in this domain we're going to be prioritizing these policy goals, and these other domains we're going to be prioritizing competition. And then I think it requires enforcers and regulators that practice humility and recognize that they have very important tools, but those tools are not always going to be the ones that need to have primacy in a particular domain. And so we need to be following those instructions from Congress and policymakers where possible.
So to clarify in some way the scope of activity of competition authority, but also to reach out to a number of other regulators with whom one can dialogue and one can convince of the interest and the importance of promoting competition. And we often are open. I mean, you gave examples of regulators who are in fact quite open to this help from the competition authority. So that's the whole holistic approach, kind of a holistic approach to competition. Esteban, as an economist, do we need new theories of harm?
Yeah, it's a challenge, but I think I agree with Lina and that. And in the perspective that how to take advantage of synergies between competition policy and public interest goals, there are different ways. Yes, competition agencies do not or cannot select always their cases, but there is a space to prioritize when agencies has to choose ex officio investigations and also market investigations and competition advocacy issues. So allocating resources, limited resources, to cases with positive externalities on public interest goals is a way to implement this. But I think this, the quote you made about Amato, Sedas, we need to adapt to changing circumstances, and we need to permanently evaluate our theories of harm. And we need to find a way to address new issues. And I will take one example, is privacy. I think it's a very good example that privacy is an increasing concern in digital economy, and taking this privacy as a competition variable is a way to think in new theories of harm. Maybe the Bundeskartellamt Facebook case was inspiring about how to rethink about theories of harm. I can tell you I can tell you about the case. There is the WhatsApp case in Argentina and Brazil. This case has an origin in the obligation for users to accept their information for WhatsApp to be used in other platforms of the Meta platforms. So there was a couple of cases with challenge the way to think in competition theories of harm, and there was two kind of theories of harm about using privacy as a competition variable. One was theories of harm of abusive or exploitative abuse of dominance because of harm to privacy. Instead of excessive pricing, we can think of not enough privacy. But there was another interesting exclusionary theory of harm about privacy policy tying different platform services, and this tying can give rise to conglomerate effects, to raise rival costs, and has the potential to exclude non-conglomerate competitors or even build barriers to other digital platforms or digital players that are trying to gain scale. So we can, in this way, have an example, concrete example of cases of the real world using new ways of thinking and new theories of harm adapted to new situations. And this could be a way to go ahead and make these synergies possible. Thank you.
Very, very good example, the last example that you took, because indeed we, competition authorities in general, have not looked at conglomerate power as much as they have about vertical or horizontal power. And therefore there we may, but we see that certainly in the digital sector, I mean, there is a rapid growth of conglomerate power of platforms, and that maybe we need to adapt or to find new ways to analyze those markets, which are a bit different than the traditional instruments that we have. Let me turn to Mick, who I think will emphasize the importance of communication across government regulators or officials to try to have a more general, holistic approach to the competition issues.
Yeah, thanks. And I think there's a risk in prescribing recipes for effectiveness by competition regulators because, as has become evident from the conversation here, we all sit within different ecosystems and environments and have different histories. So I think I would preface my remarks in Australia by saying that we're very fortunate that we have some clear objectives spelt out in our legislation, and I would say quite strong bipartisan support across the whole of government for the objectives of competition policy. And to some extent that derives from some major reforms that occurred in the Australian economy in the late 1990s, where there was a very strong focus on what was referred to as a national competition policy, which worked right across government in a whole range of areas and essentially required agencies, state legislatures and the Commonwealth to remove any unnecessary regulation, and particularly any unnecessary regulation that had the potential to reduce competition. So I think my comments come from that background, and I recognise that colleagues come from very different backgrounds, so prescriptions about how to be effective really depend on the context in which you operate. So I think that's important. I think the second thing that's important is that in the Australian situation, it's very clear where there are specialist regulators operating in a particular area, we're quite clear about the barriers or the boundaries, if you like, of the various responsibilities. And in fact, we have memorandums of understanding formally written down with other agencies that have regulatory roles, so that there's a clear delineation of, for example, in product safety, there's an electrical regulator, there's a number of other sorts of regulators, and even though we have a remit in product safety, we are quite clear about the boundaries of that. I think the other important element we have that is an assistance in getting some coherence is, and I mentioned this before, we have both competition and consumer law in our legislation. So we have very specific references to consumer law and a set of provisions that really relate to consumer protection and product safety, as well as competition law. And so, for example, what that allows us to do is engage quite closely with consumers. We have a dedicated info line and response system that receives hundreds and hundreds of thousands of contacts from consumers each year. So that, I think, probably helps to ground us in, as Spencer said, the things that matter on the kitchen table, rather than getting too carried away with stuff that's a lot more remote. And that in turn probably gives us some sort of social license credit. That means when we do have to deal with competition issues in a much more conventional decision-making framework around economic efficiency, and the result of that isn't necessarily popular. For example, you know, a major supermarket chain being able to take over a local independent supermarket, then I think that the fact that we've got a strong connection with consumers in a range of different ways means that we have a little more social license, if you like, to be able to implement that sort of decision making. We do spend a lot of time communicating with both policymakers and consumers, and I think there's a two-way exchange there, because that means we operate with policymakers on a no-surprise basis. If they've got objectives, and the example might be, for example, the childcare market where we're starting an inquiry, we understand that objective. We understand what our role is in trying to pursue that objective, and can proceed then without creating intersections or clashes between those objectives of government in the broader policy sense and our focus on markets and competition. I think our market inquiry powers are quite important in that regard, in that they enable us to get a very deep level of insight and expertise in specific sectors, and that can be very important as well, because you know, I don't think that's available from more desk-bound processes where you're not engaging closely with the industry. And I know that the purists might say, well, what about regulatory capture? And I think we're fortunate in Australia in that the systems are robust enough to provide some checks and balances against that. So I think that's important. The other thing that obviously is important is the quality of staff and the ability we have to support and enhance the skills of those staff. I think that that means they're alert to the wide range of issues that we deal with, and understand what's going on in terms of the broader policy objective, and can ensure their thinking means that, or takes that into consideration. So they're just a few of the ingredients of the recipe, but the recipe, I think, probably varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I don't think you can possibly cut out a template and say, this is how you do it. It's very much based on where you come from. And look, I've spoken a lot about the public policy issues, but at our core, we are an economic regulator. We are a regulator who's focused on competition. We are focused on consumer outcomes that minimise the harm to consumers and maximise the welfare and benefits flowing to the economy. So that's always at the core of our work as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think that you're very right in saying that this panel doesn't ambition to be prescriptive in any way. We're trying to confront experiences to see, and then it will be up to everybody, all the delegates here to decide what could be useful, could be adapted, would be a good idea. So the description is more important than the prescription. A lot of ideas have already been put on the table, having a framework such as a national competition policy. This was alluded to a couple of times. A holistic approach across government, technical ministries, a dialogue between competition authorities, institutional arrangements, and Mick has just talked about some of the benefits that one can get from being both a competition law enforcer as well as a consumer protection agency in terms of forcing you to be alert to the things that really matter to consumers, and also market inquiries is an instrument which allows a broader perspective and therefore a deeper analysis without the constraints that one has when one is dealing with cases and applying narrow concepts. The necessity to adapt the theories of harm to a changing makeup of some sectors. So let me turn to Johannes, and given the experience that and the circumstances that you have described of very high concentration and a lot of difficulty to try to bring a competition, what are the things that you think could be most useful, which are different maybe from the traditional approach to competition policy?
Thank you, Professor Jenny. As you rightly pointed out, there are a lot of instruments available, and what we are challenged to come up with are really solutions which are more particular to the situation we face in our country. And I think that what has been said in terms of a whole of government approach still resonates with us in its various permutations. I had talked earlier about a national competition policy, which would involve a review of regulations that seem to create an environment which is less competition friendly. And I think in the Philippines, it is even more pronounced because a lot of the anti-competitive situations that businesses operate within are actually caused or enabled by these regulations. I think it starts off from a historical context that we used to have a lot of public services which are monopolies in nature, and therefore the enabling regulatory environment sought to allow these monopolies to be perpetuated and to be entrenched, so to speak. So now that we have moved away from that kind of monopolistic public service model, then we are challenged to make sure that the accompanying regulatory framework also evolves away from that. The other thing which I thought is useful to point out is that in the Philippines, because of this concentration of power, I think that trade and investment policy has to be coordinated with competition policy. Prior to the recent amendment of our Public Services Act, the entry into the public services activities was limited to 40% foreign equity. And you can imagine that with the capital intensiveness that is required to provide all these public services, you would have a plethora of business activities that were closed off to those foreign investors who precisely not only had the capital, but also the technology to share or transfer. And I think the Competition Commission in the Philippines succeeded in working with the legislature to make sure that these markets are opened up. So I think this has to also progressively be undertaken with regard to other legislation which are still constraints. For instance, if we are to take full advantage of the burgeoning digital economy, then there's no reason why, at least to my mind, congressional franchises would still be required to operate a telecoms entity. I don't think that there are many, if at all, telecoms entities which still require a congressional franchise in order to operate and be allowed to use bandwidth. The other point, and this is perhaps a little bit more controversial, is the matter of price regulation. Now, I know I made mention earlier that we are not supposed to be price regulators. In the Philippine competition statute, however, we are allowed to go after dominant entities which engage in unfair pricing. Not simply excessive pricing, but unfair pricing. Now, is there an ex-ante way to try and achieve the fair pricing that this provision seeks to accomplish? And we have done that in the context, for instance, of pharmaceutical products. Based on our interaction with the Department of Health, we have worked on having a cap, for instance, on certain essential medicines. And this is only possible because the Department of Health in the Philippines is also engaged in some form of price regulation within their mandate. Could this practice be extended on the basis of sound market studies to other basic essential commodities? I hearken back to what Spencer had made mention earlier about there are certain products, for instance, food products, around the kitchen table kind of essential products where in a situation where these are unduly high, and rather than going on the basis of the stringent tests of excessive pricing, can we use our provision on unfair pricing to ex post go after these kinds of situations, or even perhaps explore the idea of having work or coordination with sector regulators or colleagues in government agencies to ensure that even on an ex-ante basis, there could be a way for us to help in curbing unfair pricing in these basic commodities. So, as I said, this is a little bit beyond what we are traditionally seen to be as competition authorities. Price regulation is something that we usually leave to regulators, sector regulators, but in the Philippines it would seem that there might be scope on the basis of market studies and MOUs with other sector regulators to explore this possibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Spencer?
There have been so many good examples already discussed by the folks on this panel that I'm afraid I'm going to duplicate a little bit, but I want to just bring a different frame, a different lens to this. And I think one way to achieve some of the things that we've been talking about is to back up and ask a slightly different question, which is, in the ideal world, what's the remedy you want? What is it you want to happen in the real world once you're convinced there's a problem? Once you ask that question, what do you want to have happen? What do you want to be either just what do you want to happen in the real world? You may get an answer that occasionally is you have to bring a competition case. You may also get an answer that there's a different partner or different response that you want. And I think this is one way of thinking about the whole of government approach that we've been talking about, and you've already heard about hearing aids, but it's such a great answer. If you have a situation, as I gather in the hearing aids industry, where there's no proof of a cartel, there's no single firm dominant, but the real problem is they cost too much because you need a prescription in the old days from a doctor. This is in the United States, obviously. Well, once you frame the question, what is it you want? You want lower prices. Then the answer is you don't need an antitrust investigation. You need the Food and Drug Administration to pass a rule that eliminates the requirement of a doctor's prescription so they can be sold across over the counter, and consumers and regular ordinary market conditions are likely to bring the price down by thousands of dollars in some cases. And I think this is a really helpful framework, because when you have some agencies like Australia and the FTC that have both consumer and competition policies, the answer may be you've got a real problem, but the remedy lies on the consumer protection side. And I'll go back to 30 years ago. There was a society of dentists in California that had rules framed as ethics rules that effectively prohibited even truthful advertising of price and most non-price claims. This is before the internet. This is print advertising, like phone books and other kinds of advertising materials. But dentists could not truthfully, full disclosure, my father was a dentist, could not advertise price discounts in California and be a member in good standing of this organization. And the FTC challenged on antitrust grounds, and it was a very complicated case, and they eventually lost 5-4 in the US Supreme Court. But if you think about what the problem was and what the remedy you want is, which is truthful advertising, the remedy may well have better lay on the consumer protection side. And the FTC back then could have, if they had wanted to, brought a consumer protection claim against that, or both. There's ways of combining both claims in the same case. And in the event that your agencies and your countries, the Consumer Protection Agency is not the same as the Competition Agency, well, if you're taking a whole of government approach, it's a degree of humility, it's a degree of backing off and saying, here's the problem, here's the solution we think is the right way to go. It may be somebody else's other than the competition agency proceeding. Another example that's already been discussed, if you believe that poultry farmers are being taken care of by the large agricultural buyers and producers of meat and poultry, it may or may not be an antitrust problem. It may or may not be a problem that a regulatory agency can address under that agency's rulemaking or specialized competition statute. Again, if you're thinking to broaden the scope of antitrust in the United States beyond what is in the Clayton and Sherman Act, well, one way to do it is, of course, to get Congress to do something, but another way is to start with a policy statement such as what Lina Khan has already described, defining unfair methods of competition in light of the existing history and statute, and then go forward with other cases, other potential rulemaking, and get validation of that in the courts. We've also talked a little bit about data privacy concerns. And again, some of those concerns sound in antitrust, like the Facebook case that we've talked about in Germany. Some of them sound in consumer protection, as is some of the efforts in the United States. And it raises the question more generally, do we need new legislation or rules that are bespoke in nature? Is there something about the digital platforms that require different kinds of more specialized antitrust rules rather than the general off-the-shelf rules in the United States, the Sherman Act and Clayton Act and FTC Act, and other countries obviously have rules of general applicability. And so in the United States, for example, there are a variety of legislation proposals that would apply to digital gatekeepers defined various ways. And of course, there's a Digital Markets Act already that does that approach. And so in this, in my approach, you're beginning with what are you trying to achieve in the real world by way of relief or remedies? And that really requires, I think, in most cases, not just competition advocacy, but partnerships of some of the kinds that you've discussed already. There is the possibility that the sectoral regulators are not appreciating competition values in the same way that folks in this room typically do. And that just exists in the real world. One possible way to address that is to embed competition officers or competition officials within on a temporary or permanent basis to be that voice. I'm just trying to think of other things that we haven't specifically talked about. For example, in the US system, if the goal is compensation to consumers, you may have to rely on state attorney generals and private enforcement to get that kind of direct compensation to consumers, given that in civil cases, our agencies generally can't directly either get fines or direct money to consumers. That may require sort of a different kind of whole of government approach, which is some kind of a public-private partnership in the right circumstances. And then, of course, what if you don't know you know there is a problem, but you're not sure the scope of it, and you're not sure at this stage what the relief you want is or what you hope to achieve. Well, then we've talked also about market studies and market inquiries that can lead to new legislation, in some cases, industry codes that are very specific, that cover, like in England, the grocery industry, and I gather in Australia there's some industry-specific competition codes as well. And I would say, again, if you're not sure what the problem is, I do know that market studies obviously require a lot of information, a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of people. Engage the universities, engage the NGOs in your communities. They are on the ground and in many cases are the first line of detection in trying to figure out the problem. And once you figure out what the problem is, then you can figure out what the solution you want is. Then you can figure out where in the government or outside you have your best shot of winning, and sometimes you will and sometimes you won't.
Thank you very much for this eloquent plea for substituting, in a sense, potential remedies over potential principles that would apply. I mean, because there was the sense of what you were saying, that we should be mindful of remedies and trying to find then either the best instrument or the support that one can find. Let me finally turn to Tembi for a last comment on this in the context of South Africa.
I think almost everything has been said, except maybe I can add two more things. And I agree with what's been said on remedies, that we have an opportunity for forward-looking remedies in almost all enforcement areas, especially with abuse of dominance and measures. I think in measures, especially where you have gatekeepers, and gatekeepers are not always digital. Sometimes, you know, we had a measure in the beer in the beer sector, and the dominant firms would be manufacturer of bottles or would have some exclusive supply arrangement with the only bottle manufacturer or manufacturer of crowns. So I think when we think of remedies in those circumstances, we have to think about not just the merging parties, but the entire market. And that measure just gives us the opportunity to get there and try and fix the problem going forward. Do the same with abuse of dominance cases. And we've done this. We also have the power. I mean, it's easier to do market access remedies and things like that. It's much more complex to deal with price. So we do have this power as well to do excessive pricing. And sometimes we have imposed price caps where we've seen like excessive abuse, and parties want to settle, and they say, well, how do we settle? We say, okay, this is the price cap. That's generally easier if the market somehow can fix that in the medium to long term. So we had internet service providers. The price of internet generally is going down, so the remedy would just fasten the pace, will quicken the pace of prices going down, and in a sense, the market will then take over that pricing. But there are markets where we've battled with price remedies, where we impose a remedy and a couple of years down the line, the parties come back and price doesn't work. It's a little bit embarrassing. We have to go and lift the remedy because quite clearly we didn't think through. So pricing has had these problems. In the context of cartels, Spencer, we have imposed limit or margins that can be earned. In the case of bread, because bread is consumers. I mean, you can find people, but you can find firms, but people will never be satisfied, because it's like, what about the victims who are bread consumers, everyday bread consumers? So in that case, we forced one company we settled with that it wouldn't, we put a cap on the margin, and we didn't announce it. And we were hoping that all the companies will then be forced to price down, and that would be a way of recouping. This also had mixed results. We can't really trace that it had been successful. So I would be a little more skeptical about price remedies. And the last thing I wanted to add was this. We probably need to add some theories around issues of access, because not all the economic tests address these issues. So we've had issues where people's banking accounts are closed, right? And if you can't have access to banking, then you can't trade. So there is a right affected there. So I think a more of a socio-economic rights approach probably is warranted in some cases where the exclusionary conduct might not fit a particular economic theory, but in fact, it affects the entity or a person's right so fundamentally that they are excluded completely from the market. They don't have a right to trade. So I think we have to think also from a rights perspective sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this rich thoughts and new thoughts on new approaches. I think that we have had wide diversities of views, but a common desire to try to be pragmatic, to approach the problem, and therefore to look at the competition issue in a slightly different perspective. Now, we have a few minutes, so I mean, we would be very happy if there are comments or questions that you want to address. I know that Consumer International, I have no idea where Consumer International is. Oh, over there, okay, way in the back, provided a contribution to this roundtable, so I want to give Consumer International the floor. If anybody else wants to intervene, offer thoughts, you're very welcome to participate. Consumers International.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The goals of competition policy should be to engage with the biggest concerns of consumers with what they see as the biggest harms to them. Now, the biggest concerns of consumers everywhere are high and rising prices and their impact on the cost of living. We believe there is scope for competition agencies to go beyond their usual business and to adopt somewhat more activist prices policies, not price controls in general, but there is more that could be done on pricing. We have other concerns. Generally, the evidence of reduced competition would suggest that we need yet more active and vigorously enforced competition laws and no shyness in using every instrument available, including, where appropriate, divestiture or the threat of it. And third, the other big concern is government restrictions on competition. When the history of competition policy comes to be written, it will get a good pass for antitrust law, but it's done very, very little. Its big failure has been to do much about government restrictions on competition. So turning to prices, the current inflation is not just a monetary phenomenon, it's also driven by supply-side factors, expectations of inflation being built into price setting and wage setting, ongoing high prices in monopoly areas, some profiteering, some exploitation of short-term market power, made especially possible by the current high inflation and by the widespread disruption in numerous sectors of the world economy, and by government causes of high prices. So a pure monetary and fiscal policy approach, well, hardly any fiscal policy being used at the moment, but a pure monetary policy approach is a blunt, costly, and not necessarily fully effective way of dealing with these matters. So we think consideration should be given by competition authorities and governments to doing some things, to investigate supply-side drivers of high prices, to expose unwarranted incorporation of inflationary expectations in prices, to highlight, expose and shame some of the cases of profiteering, of abuse of market power occurring in the current economic situation, and to expose government-caused high prices, and generally vigorously enforce competition law more strongly in areas where markups have risen so much. Regarding food, I'd just say there are numerous trade and other distortions harming prices and output, and there's similar comments to make about energy. But to return to my main point about a somewhat more active approach to prices policy, I believe there should be measures supported by governments to address public concerns about prices by identifying, monitoring, studying, exposing, in some cases shaming, influencing, and in some cases restraining and sanctioning such prices. That would be to engage with what is regarded by many as the biggest global economic problem facing economies at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katz. For those of you who did not participate in the competition committee proceedings, I just want to say that yesterday we had a roundtable precisely on competition and inflation. And some of the ideas, which this was a very rich roundtable, where several things came to the fore. One of them is that indeed, particularly when, as is the case now, the inflation has been started by either supply shocks or demand shocks, there may be an intersection between inflation and rising prices. For example, there may be firms that take advantage of the fact that we're in an inflationary period to collude more easily because they have to anticipate price increases, and they tend to agree on what those price increases be, and they fuel themselves the mechanism of inflation. So there are intersections between competition and inflation, and so I would direct you, among other things, to the contributions which have been made for this roundtable. I see that. Who's that?
United States. United States.
Oh, United States. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Assistant Attorney General Jonathan Kanter has been clear on his views on the goals of competition policy, which I wanted to share some of those views today. He has said that U.S. antitrust law has one goal and one purpose, which is to protect competition. This proposition is so fundamental to his enforcement philosophy that he has identified it as the first of 5 pillars of an effective antitrust enforcement regime. Competition is about rivalry at every level. That includes competition over price or over whatever consumers provide in exchange for a product or service, whether that's personal information or data. Competition can exist over anything that causes somebody to choose one firm over another. The welfare of end consumers is just one of many goals of competition policy. The debate around the, quote, consumer welfare standard has become a distraction from understanding the goal of protecting competition. He has highlighted 3 problematic aspects of the debate. First, there are versions of the consumer welfare standard that say that U.S. antitrust law was intended to promote wealth and output, but do nothing to protect our democracy from corporate power or to promote choice and opportunity for individuals and small businesses. That is incorrect. The language and history of the U.S. antitrust laws shows a profound concern with economic liberty, not merely as an economic concept, but as a concept connected to the freedom of our nation. The second major problem is that some suggest we should focus only on quantifying the effects of a transaction or conduct using complex economic models. But this approach is detached from the competitive realities actually playing out in the markets. And instead of making judgments easier in hard cases, it has often made even the easy cases hard to judge. Third, some articulate a version of the consumer welfare standard that is blind to workers, farmers, and others who benefit from a competitive economy. End consumers are important beneficiaries of antitrust enforcement, but they are not the only beneficiaries. Ignoring some beneficiaries and focusing only on end consumers is a value judgment. That value judgment goes beyond the competencies of enforcers. Antitrust enforcers should not decide what values should be promoted at the expense of others. Our job is simply to promote competition and then let the benefits, whether they are measurable or not, flow from the competitive process. A focus on competition also allows for predictable and fair antitrust enforcement. The agencies have developed the tools and experience to analyze this question over decades. We can also use real-world evidence, economics, expertise, and common sense to determine whether conduct harms competition. Focusing on rivalry and competition helps us decide the tough cases in particular cases as markets evolve. And this is not to say that there will never be hard issues and hard cases. There's still plenty of room for debate and expertise. But focusing on competition ensures that we remain faithful to the underlying purpose of the antitrust laws, which is to protect competition to the benefit of consumers, workers, and democratic society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. Are there, I see that Kutz would like to take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I fully support what Alan Fels spoke before me, but at the same time, I have a little departure from what he said in order to understand it in the context of economic democracy. We believe that good competition policy or good competition law should enable the promotion of good economic democracy, which means all market players. If you see the objects of most of the competition laws, it not only talks about consumers, but it also talks about the other players in the market. And therefore, we have the risk of ignoring the totality of the situation by focusing only on consumers. But what I liked about the statement from the lady from the United States is the change in understanding about consumer welfare, which is now slowly something which we see in the developing world, is something of public welfare. Not only consumers, but producers, small producers particularly, which are equally important. And many of the panelists have spoken about the factors that how small producers are to be protected from the vagaries of the market through good competition interventions. Secondly, Chairman, what was not said by the Australian delegate and the panel as well as Alan here is the distinction between competition policy and competition law. Something which the OECD also does a lot of work is, for example, competitive neutrality. That is again a very important factor in order to promote economic democracy, but it is not a competition law function. It is a public policy function, which we have to look at in totality as against, I mean, there are several other issues where we see what we have understood competition policy is generally to tackle such policy-induced anti-competitive outcomes which cannot be tackled under the competition law because they have been sanctioned by some policy or some other law, which was mentioned to in passing by Lina, for example, when she spoke about the kind of labor laws which exist in the US. I mean, there are examples of how labor has also to be protected in the context of a brute competitive pressure, which can lead to exploitation. It's not only talking about non-compete clauses, but I'm talking about the workman category as such, which there have been examples of that which can be tackled through good understanding of public policy rather than competition law. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Katz. Let me turn to Biak.
Thank you, Chair. We've very much appreciated this discussion. I think the problems that are being discussed are real problems, and they're serious problems, and they're problems that need solutions. And there are a lot of sort of creative discussions about application of the competition laws that are useful, discussion of new theories of harm, discussion of direct tools and complementary tools that can be used to solve those problems, All of those things we endorse and we support. We have one comment and one question for the panel. Our comment is this, that some of what was discussed seems to go beyond competition policy, competition enforcement, and very much represents what we think of as public policy. And to the extent you're talking about public policy, by way of what I would observe is essentially economic planning, we think that is a discussion that is not one to be held strictly in the competition sector. Public policy demands a discussion among a broader segment of governments, economies, and the public. In other words, while competition can acknowledge and help on all of these areas, it can't solve all of these problems, and it should not be used as a tool to solve all of these problems. The second is a question, and the question is based on the observation about high margins, about how inflation has driven up prices. Those are serious problems, and they're problems that need to be addressed. But my question is this: what is an individual business to do when it is faced with limited supply and very high demand? How should it decide how and where to sell its limited supply? What is fair? I think I know what the economics say about that, but there seems to be a lot of focus placed or blame placed on companies for following what I think are those economics. And if there's a different answer, I guess I'd be very interested to know what that answer is. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. To be two things. One of them is, I think it's fairly clear from the discussion we had that no one on the panel thinks that competition is going to solve all the social, the wider social issues that we've been discussed. And I think that the discussion, I mean, if you disagree, you'll tell me, but I think that the discussion was limited to whether marginally or maybe a little bit more than marginally competition policy could take on board some of those considerations without alienating or diminishing the consistency of competition policy. So I quite agree with you that if one wants to talk about those issues in general, then it's a public policy forum that would deal with this, but this was not really the purpose of the panel. On the second issue, it is 2 minutes to 1. I mean, I'm thankful for you for having suggested a topic for next year on pricing and monopoly pricing, excessive pricing, fair pricing, and what our firm's supposed to do. I'm afraid that it is a bit late, even though your question is quite interesting. And of course, I think that you have seen that there were, even among the panelists, differences of perspective on this issue, which means that they were sensitive to some of the questions that you asked. But I don't think that we're going to give an answer right now, but we'll keep this for a future debate. So thank you very much. I don't see any flag up, and that's pretty good because we're all supposed to move to have our photograph taken at 1 o'clock in the hallway to celebrate the fact that we're again together. Before we do that, I want to really thank all the panelists because I think that they gave, again, this was not a prescriptive panel. This was a panel which was describing some of the issues that competition authorities face and testifying to the way in which in different jurisdictions there were answers to those questions. But I think it was very useful and very interesting. So I thank you very much for your participation. I want to call on everybody to say that this afternoon, 2:30, we will have a debate on subsidies, seen from the point of view of trade and competition. Can competition law take on board the disruptive aspect of subsidies? Does it do it? Does it not do it? What are the issues there? So I expect to see you all back at 2:30 and have a very good lunch. And thank again to all the participants to this panel. And see if everybody could move to the steps over there, that would facilitate the picture taking.